The milk in Daniel Morris's bottle was still warm when the 2-year-old vanished from a quiet working-class neighborhood in Macon, Georgia. Population 10,412. That June morning unfolded under a thick layer of humid southern sunshine that draped itself over wooden porches and the red dirt road cutting through the small residential cluster. At 9:42 a.m., Daniel's neighbor, Mrs. Lydia Carter, glanced out her kitchen window and saw the little boy playing beneath the magnolia tree right at the edge of the narrow yard that separated their two southern-style homes she had lived beside for more than 3 decades. Daniel was fiddling with his wooden toy car, his second birthday gift, the same one Mrs. Carter had seen him carrying every morning. The elderly woman watched the tiny figure for a long moment before turning away to reach for a dish rag on the counter, an action she believed lasted only a few seconds. What happened in the next 3 minutes would haunt Macon for more than half a century. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the latest cases. On that May morning in 1964, the town of Macon, Georgia still wore the familiar calm of the American South, scattered wood frame houses with tin roofs along red dirt roads, small stores that opened whenever the owners felt like it. A few men standing around the gas station talking politics and gossip that always traveled faster than actual serious crime. Crime in Macon was low, but suspicion between people still lingered beneath lingering social tensions and inequality, making residents both wary and accustomed to the slow pace of life in the region. The Morris family lived on the eastern edge of town in a single-story, ivory-painted wooden house with a wide front porch. Howard Morris worked at the nearby lumber mill and usually left the house early to make his shift, while Evelyn stayed home to care for their son and manage everything else. 2-year-old Daniel Morris was an active child who often played alone in the front yard while his mother cleaned the kitchen or hung laundry. They weren't a wealthy family, but Howard's steady job and Evelyn's full-time care made life comfortable enough and orderly. They were used to neighbors who had known each other for years, and they were also used to the presence of one particular figure, Mrs. Lydia Carter, a widow in her 60s who lived 2 houses down. Every morning Miss Lydia had the habit of sitting in her wooden rocking chair on the porch, watching the street and chatting with anyone who passed by. Her porch offered a nearly unobstructed view of the entire Morris front yard, and it was that careful habit of observation that made her the first person to notice something unusual that day. Around 10 o'clock, Mrs. Lydia spotted a strange man standing at the end of the block, leaning against an old green sedan. He wasn't doing anything except looking around the neighborhood, too long to be someone just asking for directions, yet not obvious enough to say he meant harm. Mrs. Lydia kept her eyes on him for several minutes, feeling a slight unease, but telling herself he was probably just waiting for someone. When Evelyn carried a basket of laundry out to the backyard, Daniel was sitting on the dirt in the front yard, clutching the tin toy car he loved. That was the time Evelyn usually used to do a few quick chores, just 2 or 3 minutes, the brief window when the boy was not directly supervised. Daniel quietly pushed his little car back and forth on the cement stoop, unaware that the green sedan had begun slowly rolling toward the gate. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lydia stepped inside to refill her water pitcher and lost sight of the yard for just a few seconds. When she came back out, the green car was gone from view, and so was Daniel. From the backyard, Evelyn stepped into the front yard, drying her hands on a towel, and called Daniel's name out of habit. There was no answer. Only when she walked closer to the empty patch in front of the stoop did she realize the silence was wrong. She called louder, ran around the porch, circled to the back, then came back to the front. No sign of Daniel. The area that always echoed with little footsteps and toddler babble now held only the wind rustling the pine branches. In a panic, Evelyn ran to Lydia's house, and the moment Mrs. Lydia heard the question, "Did you see Daniel?" her legs went weak as she looked toward the gate. The wooden gate stood ajar, and Daniel's tin toy car lay on its side near the edge of the grass, as if it had fallen when he was pulled away, or when he hurriedly followed someone. The two women shouted up and down the street, and within minutes neighbors poured out to search the area. But after just a few circles around the house, the bushes and the roadside, they understood Daniel had not simply wandered off. There were no small footprints leading away, no crying, no sound breaking the morning stillness, only a sudden chilling void right in front of the house. With panic rising in her throat, Evelyn rushed back inside, grabbed the phone, and reported the incident to the nearest police station, trying to explain in broken sentences that her son had disappeared in just a few minutes. The information from that call was quickly relayed to the 911 switchboard at 10:14 a.m. and entered into the system under the code Child Missing, a code that in 1964 did not automatically trigger any special alert mechanism because widespread missing child alert systems did not yet exist. The dispatcher asked Evelyn Morris several key details: the child's age, the last time he was seen, the area of disappearance, and a basic description of the state of the yard. Upon confirming that Daniel was only 2 years old and had vanished in a matter of minutes, the dispatcher immediately forwarded the report to the nearest Bibb County Sheriff's Patrol Unit and marked it medium-high priority under the regulations of the time. The first patrol car arrived at the Morris family's Ivory house less than 10 minutes later. 2 officers stepped out, visually scanned the entire front yard before entering to gather facts. The wooden gate was open wider than usual. The dirt near the cement stoop showed no major disturbance. And Daniel's tin toy car lay tilted toward the grass as if it had dropped while he was still playing. One officer recorded every detail in the initial report while asking Evelyn to describe exactly the last time she saw her son, who was in the house, which doors were open, and how long the boy had been out of adult sight. The timeline she provided allowed them to quickly reconstruct the critical minutes. Daniel was last seen between approximately 9:58 a.m. Evelyn began searching the yard around 10:05 after noticing the unusual quiet. The 911 call was placed at 10:14. Patrol officers arrived on scene around 10:24. That less than half-hour window was noted in the report as a rapid response sequence, because for a 2-year-old, the ability to wander far on his own is extremely limited. When the second patrol unit arrived, officers began dividing the area and personnel. One officer broke the Morris yard into search grids: the porch, under the stoop, the row of bushes along the fence, and the uneven grassy patch leading to the main road. One team was assigned to canvass neighboring homes and quickly ask residents within a 5-house radius whether they had seen anything unusual in the past 30 minutes. Another team was tasked with taking a detailed statement from Mrs. Lydia Carter, the witness with the best vantage point in the entire neighborhood, and clarifying the description of the green sedan, the direction it traveled, and the behavior of the strange man she had described earlier. Meanwhile, the officer in charge of the scene ordered that no one touch the gate or Daniel's toy, treating them as the initial pieces of evidence for determining the state of the scene at the moment of disappearance. A map of the neighborhood was spread across the hood of a patrol car, and the first search radius was circled at 300 meters from the Morris gate, encompassing a stretch of road toward the highway, 3 side paths, and the vacant lot beside the old sawmill. Officers were assigned to sweep that radius in expanding concentric circles, starting from the front yard, moving outward to the fence, then farther along the trails. They quickly checked for tracks in the dirt, but found no child-sized footprints that matched. No drag marks, and nothing else besides the already noted toy car. These details were added to the scene report as part of the initial picture: a child who vanished in an extremely short window, leaving no signs of independent movement. While Evelyn was taken back inside to avoid contaminating the scene and to be available for further questions, the entire area in front of the Morris house officially became the center of an emergency search. Officers continued combing the front yard, noting every small observation and considering every possibility, from Daniel walking off on his own to a stranger approaching him. Every step followed the standard procedures of 1964, when searches for missing children relied almost entirely on eyesight and speed of response at the scene. Once the initial documentation was complete, and no new signs turned up in the immediate area, investigators moved to the next critical step, reconstructing the full timeline by pinpointing exactly where and when Daniel was last seen. That location was right next to the cement stoop in front of the house, where the tin toy car was found fallen over and where Mrs. Lydia Carter confirmed she had seen Daniel sitting and playing between approximately 9:50 and 9:55 a.m. Establishing this marker was the first step in building a minute-by-minute timeline based on combining statements from Evelyn, Mrs. Lydia, and 2 other nearby residents. From the information gathered, police began breaking the events into clear time points. 9:50 a.m. Daniel playing in the yard, holding his silver-colored toy. 9:52 a.m. Strange man appears near the green sedan at the end of the block. Approx. 9:55 a.m. Mrs. Lydia still sees Daniel in the yard when she steps back onto her porch. Approx. 9:56. 9:58 a.m. A young neighbor sees the green sedan rolling slowly past the Morris house. Approx. 10 a.m. Evelyn finishes hanging laundry in the backyard. Approx. 10:05 a.m. Evelyn notices the yard is unnaturally quiet and starts calling Daniel's name. 10:14 a.m. 911 call is placed. These times were cross-referenced with the locations of family members at the same moments. Howard had left for the lumber mill before 8 a.m., confirmed by his time card. Evelyn was in the kitchen and backyard between 9:50 and 10:05, out of sight of the front yard, for only 2-3 minutes. No one else was in the house, besides mother and son. When these positions were compared with Daniel's activity, police concluded the boy had remained within a radius of just a few meters around the cement stoop and front fence before disappearing. Another key factor to verify was when the front gate was opened. Evelyn stated she had not opened it that morning, and Mrs. Lydia said it was closed at approximately 9:50. This allowed them to narrow the gate opening window to between 9:50 and 10:05, the exact period Daniel vanished, and the same period the strange man disappeared from Mrs. Lydia's view. Officers examined the area around the side gate for any child tracks. The ground in front of the yard was fairly soft from light rain the previous night, soft enough to hold footprints if Daniel had walked out on his own. However, they found only some faint adult shoe prints and no small child footprints or drag marks that matched the size or gait of a 2-year-old. This finding allowed them to almost completely rule out the possibility that Daniel left the yard and wandered off nearby. Instead, they leaned toward the theory that he was carried or placed into a vehicle in a much shorter time frame than initially estimated. After concluding the child had not moved under his own power, police began mapping possible escape routes the suspect could have used. Based on the last known position of the green sedan and the direction reported by the neighbor boy, 3 main routes were marked. 1. Maple Road toward the vacant land behind the neighborhood. 2. Pine Road up the small hill connecting to the town's main street. 3. A right turn onto the road leading directly to the I-75 highway entrance, less than a quarter mile from the Morris house. The highway route was prioritized because it matched descriptions of the car moving quickly and the extremely short window that would require any pursuit to be launched immediately to be effective. Officers continued cross-checking every piece of information, time, location, and the stranger's behavior before leaving, to determine which route was most feasible for removing a child from the scene in under 10 minutes. Although they could not yet pinpoint the sedan's final direction, the preliminary timeline allowed police to recognize the speed and deliberate nature of the disappearance and to narrow the points that needed immediate follow-up within the travel radius closest to the time of the incident. After completing the preliminary timeline, police moved to the next critical step, collecting detailed statements from witnesses living around the Morris home to cross-reference with the established timeline. The primary and most important witness remained Mrs. Lydia Carter, who had a direct line of sight to the Morris yard and most of the street in front. She stated that the man she saw between approximately 9:50 and 9:55 was tall, somewhat thin, wearing a light gray shirt and dark trousers. She couldn't clearly see his face because of the distance and sunlight reflecting off that direction, but she clearly remembered his slightly slouched posture and the way he scanned the area as if looking for someone or waiting for something. She also confirmed the old green sedan had been parked at the end of the block for several minutes and that the man had stood beside it for a long time before the car started moving. The second statement came from a 12-year-old boy who lived 2 houses away. He said that around 10 a.m., while riding his bike to the end of the street, he saw a green car speed past, kicking up a lot of dust, turning and accelerating as if trying to leave the area fast. He didn't get a clear look at the license plate or anyone inside except the shadow of the driver. However, he was certain it was an older long-body sedan, dull green unlike newer shiny models. The third witness was a delivery truck driver passing through the area at a time that matched the timeline. He stated that as his truck went past the section near the Morris house, he glanced at a green sedan turning onto the main road and briefly saw a small figure sitting in the front passenger seat, a size consistent with a child. He couldn't confirm gender or exact age because it was only a passing reflection, but the important point was that the figure was noticeably smaller than an adult and sitting toward the door without a seatbelt, common at the time, but still enough to catch his attention. Statements from 3 immediately adjacent households were collected regarding any unusual sounds or movement before Daniel disappeared. One family said they heard an older car engine rev louder than usual, but didn't think anything of it since many old cars in the area were patched together. The second family reported hearing a faint metallic sound like something brushing the gate or fence, lasting only a few seconds and not loud enough to stand out. The third family said they heard tires crunching on dirt along with a sudden engine rev, matching the 9:58, 10 o'clock window according to their wall clock. When these statements were compiled and compared, police found consistency only on a few key points. All mentioned the green sedan, the car leaving between 9:55 and 10 o'clock, and the presence of an adult figure or a child-sized shadow inside the vehicle. Inconsistencies appeared in other details such as the speed of departure, the direction of the turn, the sounds heard, and identifying features of the strange man. The lack of uniformity forced police to create an information filtering chart, marking details that could be verified and separating those reliant on hazy memory. The chart was divided into 3 categories: confirmed facts, possibly accurate, but needing further verification, and inconsistent data. This filtering chart became the first foundation for continuing to narrow the scope of suspicion and determining which points required immediate re-examination at the scene in the hours that followed. After completing the collection of witness statements in the immediate vicinity of the Morris home and finishing the information screening board, police immediately shifted to a wide area search phase, recognizing that the time frame of Daniel's disappearance was extremely narrow yet still sufficient for a suspect to remove the child from the front yard area. They began mobilizing support from local residents, calling on every household in the neighborhood to join the voluntary search. In less than half an hour, more than 30 residents within a 2-block radius had gathered in front of the Morris yard and were divided into small groups under police direction. At the scene, a K-9 unit was dispatched from the county center, bringing 2 dogs trained specifically for missing child searches. The coordinator divided the area around the Morris home into 3 primary directions based on terrain and witness reports: north toward the low hills and brush along the woods, west along the drainage ditch that ran behind the residential area, and the highway direction, which opened onto the road leading straight to the I-75 entrance. The tracking dogs were released in teams, each consisting of 1 officer and 2 to 8 volunteers, moving slowly to scan the ground, bushes, and any unusual objects that might suggest the recent presence of a child or adult within the relevant timeline. The northern direction was considered the most likely route Daniel would have taken if the boy had wandered off on his own, so that team focused on soft soil patches, small trails, and low-lying areas at the base of the hills. They found several blurred adult shoe prints, possibly from residents walking the previous day, but no distinct small child footprints or scrape marks in the dirt, and the dogs did not pick up any fresh scent consistent with a 2-year-old. The western route along the ditch was examined closely because standing water from the previous night's rain could have preserved traces better. However, the search team recorded no slide marks, handprints, or children's items in the ditch bed, only large depressions from animals or adults. This led police to rule out the possibility that Daniel had fallen in on his own or been dragged through there in the short time frame documented. The group heading toward the highway received the heaviest manpower because it matched the direction the green sedan was reported traveling by several witnesses. They swept the access road looking for dropped items, scraps of fabric, or any sign someone had carried a child. One volunteer spotted an unevenly depressed patch of soil and several overlapping adult shoe prints. But when officers examined it closely, they determined it belonged to a road crew worker from early that morning and was unrelated to the disappearance. Along the entire length of the road leading to the highway, the search teams found no characteristic children's items such as toys or clothing, nor any signs of a struggle. By early afternoon, after every route within a 300-meter radius and the expanded areas had been covered at least twice, police concluded there were no findings that could redirect the search. The canine teams returned to the starting point after 3 separate sweeps in all directions without picking up any new scent signals. The volunteer groups came back empty-handed, carrying only adult footprints or old tire tracks that did not match the suspect vehicle description. As the sunlight grew harsher in the early afternoon and shadows shortened on the rapidly drying ground, police were forced to note in the official record that the entire first-day ground search had yielded no signs related to Daniel or any trace of movement that could broaden the investigation. No physical evidence, no breakthrough, and no change in the timeline. The large-scale search effort on the first day ended without any concrete results, forcing authorities to reassess all existing data to determine the next steps. Immediately after concluding the first day of searching without uncovering any useful traces, police shifted focus to the only lead capable of pointing to a specific investigative direction. The older model green sedan mentioned by multiple witnesses within the window, Daniel vanished. To trace this vehicle, they began by requesting registration records from the Bibb County DMV office and simultaneously contacting neighboring counties within a 20-mile radius for lists of vehicles of the same color and body style. Because vehicle records in the 1960s were not yet digitized, the lists arrived as paper files, many handwritten, requiring officers to manually screen every make, model, and production year. They narrowed the search to sedans manufactured between 1957 and 1960, the exact range matching witness descriptions of a long-body dull green paint and round headlights. Out of more than 60 green sedans in the broader area, only 12 fell within the 1957-1960 production window, and of those only 3 matched the body style described by the 12-year-old boy and Lydia Carter. Long wheelbase, faded greenish-silver green paint, visible peeling or sun damage. Police created a priority list of the 12 registered owners and began contacting each to verify their whereabouts on the morning Daniel disappeared. They started with the 3 owners living closest to the Morris home, as they had the highest likelihood of being near the scene. The first was Charles Miller, a mechanic who lived just over 1 block away. He owned a light green 1958 Plymouth Belvedere, which was inspected in his garage that same afternoon. Miller stated the car had a broken transmission for the past 2 days, corroborated by customers and coworkers who confirmed it had not left the shop in 3 straight days. Police accepted his alibi and removed him from suspicion. The second was Louise Harrington, who lived west of the neighborhood and owned a dark green 1959 Chevrolet Biscayne. She said that between approximately 9:30 and 10 a.m., she drove to the grocery store for lunch items. A receipt time-stamped 9:47 a.m. and store security footage showing her car in the parking lot confirmed she could not have been the driver of the suspicious sedan passing the Morris home. The third was Ronald Pierce, a retired driver with a grayish-green 1957 Ford Custom Line. Pierce proved his alibi by attending a veterans meeting at the community center 2 blocks away. More than 10 attendees confirmed his presence from 9 a.m. until nearly noon. With these 3 owners cleared, police continued down the list of 12 vehicles that matched the production years. The remaining 7 owners lived farther from the Morris home, some on the northern edge of town. Officers visited each address or verified through neighbors. Nearly all had solid alibis, taking children to school at that exact time. Clocked in at a factory several miles away, or out of town since early morning in a company truck. During screening, police also checked the condition of each car. Some were in the shop for repairs, some stored in garages, and some had been sold, but the paperwork not yet updated. Though each case took time to verify, the outcome was the same. None matched the description of the strange man, and none had a schedule aligning with Daniel's disappearance window. When only one owner remained unverified, police began paying closer attention to that name, Earl Whitman. Whitman lived approximately 3 blocks from the scene and owned a 1958 green sedan that matched witness descriptions exactly. Officers noted the car had been seen in the neighborhood several times in prior days, but no one knew Whitman's daily routine. When 2 officers arrived at Whitman's listed address, they found the house locked, curtains drawn, and no car in front. Neighbors reported seeing his car leave the morning Daniel disappeared, but could not pinpoint the exact time. One said Whitman often left at odd hours, sometimes very early, sometimes close to noon. Another recalled seeing the green sedan heading toward the main road that morning, but could not confirm the driver. When police attempted to contact Whitman that same afternoon, they learned he had not returned since morning. The fact that the sole remaining owner on the list could not establish an alibi, yet perfectly matched the vehicle color, model year and departure timing, led police to flag Earl Whitman as the most prominent suspect in the green sedan line of inquiry. This development was recorded as the first significant narrowing of the investigation, making Whitman the central figure requiring verification in the next phase of filtering leads related to Daniel Morris's disappearance. After the green sedan trace narrowed to only Earl Whitman, police immediately began pulling his personal file from county records and local archives to assess potential involvement. Official records showed Whitman was born in 1931 in a small Alabama town, had moved to Macon, Georgia roughly 8 months before the disappearance, and rented a small wooden house near the southern edge of the neighborhood. His employment was unstable. Records indicated brief stints at a lumber yard, followed by seasonal work at a used car repair shop, which he also left after only a few weeks. Neighbors described him as reclusive, usually keeping his doors and windows closed, and driving the green sedan away at irregular hours, sometimes very early some days, near noon on others, making his routine unpredictable. In legal records, police found 3 minor offenses: a public disturbance charge 2 years earlier, a speeding ticket, and an administrative violation stemming from a neighbor dispute. There was no history of violent crimes or anything involving children, but the minor infractions combined with his withdrawn personality made Whitman noteworthy. When 2 officers located Whitman at home the following morning, they conducted an initial interview. Whitman answered the door appearing surprised and wary, but agreed to speak on the porch. When asked about his whereabouts the morning Daniel disappeared, Whitman claimed he left around 9 a.m. to visit a repair shop, looking for parts from an acquaintance, returning near noon. However, when pressed for the acquaintance's name, exact address and precise times, his answers were vague. He could not provide a clear name or remember the location. When asked to pin down his departure time, he changed his statement from around 9 o'clock to maybe 9:30 or later, suspiciously aligning with Daniel's disappearance window. One officer asked directly whether he had driven the green sedan that morning. Whitman said yes, but claimed not to recall the route. When asked about his usual route to the repair shop, he described a path that made no sense because it did not pass any parts stores. Police noted in the report that Whitman's statements contained multiple inconsistencies within the first 10 minutes. After this brief exchange, officers examined the exterior of the property. The green sedan matching witness descriptions was parked in the yard. Long body, faded paint faded with visible peeling on the front bumper. This made it nearly identical to the car seen by the 12-year-old boy and Lydia Carter, further strengthening the possibility Whitman was the stranger near the scene just before Daniel vanished. However, police could not inspect the interior without a warrant, and Whitman, though visibly nervous, had no legal obligation to allow it absent probable cause. Despite rising suspicion, no physical evidence appeared near Whitman's home or in related search areas directly linking him to Daniel. No children's clothing, toys, drag marks, small footprints, or any physical proof placed Whitman near the Morris yard during the disappearance window. All police had was an unverified timeline, a vehicle matching the description, and Whitman's nervous demeanor, three concerning factors but insufficient for detention or a search warrant. When officers pressed Whitman for more precise departure details, he continued giving vague, evasive answers, claiming he was not fully awake that morning and therefore could not remember clearly. A neighbor near Whitman later told police he saw Whitman drive away between 9:40 and 10 a.m., almost perfectly overlapping Daniel's disappearance. Another witness at the end of the block recalled the green sedan passing quickly at the same time, but could not confirm who was inside. These two statements aligned on timing, but offered no proof Daniel was in the car, leading police to note that Whitman's departure coinciding exactly with the disappearance window was a critical point of suspicion, yet still lacked conclusive elements. After compiling everything collected that day, police issued a formal assessment. Whitman had no verifiable alibi, gave contradictory statements, owned a vehicle matching witness descriptions, and displayed unusual morning behavior. However, direct or physical evidence tying him to Daniel remained absent. They therefore could not seek an arrest warrant or search warrant at that stage. In the investigative file, Earl Whitman was entered as the #1 priority suspect, flagged for surveillance and further verification in subsequent steps, and became the primary focus of all future reports and supplemental statements related to Daniel Morris's disappearance. Immediately after placing Earl Whitman on the primary suspect list, police re-examined the area map to identify every possible route the green sedan could have taken to leave the scene within Daniel's disappearance window. This re-examination exposed a critical error in the initial response phase. Interstate I-75, only a little more than a quarter mile from the Morris home and the fastest escape route out of town, had not been sealed off in time after the missing child call was relayed to patrol units. This meant that if the strange man described by witnesses was indeed the abductor, he had nearly half an hour to travel far beyond the search radius police established that morning. When the lead investigator reviewed the traffic map, the route from the Morris home to the I-75 on-ramp stood out as a perfect escape corridor. Only two short residential streets, no traffic lights, light morning traffic, and no permanent police checkpoints nearby. In an older sedan at normal speed, a suspect could drive from either Whitman's house or the Morris yard to the highway entrance in under 3 minutes. From there, the interstate offered two directions: north toward more populated central counties or south, reaching the state line in under 20 minutes. Upon closer calculation, the investigator realized that if the suspect turned onto the highway and accelerated to 50-60 mph, a speed that would not draw attention that time of day, the vehicle could have been completely outside Bibb County jurisdiction by the time police began establishing their search perimeter. The mistake became stark when timelines were compared. The first patrol car arrived at the scene at 10:24 a.m. Witness canvassing wrapped up around 10:40 a.m. The 300-meter ground search teams deployed around 10:50 a.m. Throughout that period, No emergency traffic blockade order was issued for the I-75 ramps. Child abduction response protocols in 1964 were far less advanced than in later decades. But with the data now available, investigators acknowledged that failure to control that route cost them the single best opportunity to locate and stop the green sedan in the earliest phase of the case. The gravity of this oversight grew when police revisited the truck driver's statement about seeing the silhouette of a small child slumped in the front seat of a sedan heading toward the highway. Had the area been sealed within the first 10-12 minutes, patrol units might have intercepted the vehicle or at least obtained a license plate or additional descriptors. Instead, they were left with only vague witness recollections. The lead investigator clearly stated in the report that failing to set up roadblocks at the highway access points immediately upon determining a vehicle may have been involved constituted a systemic shortfall, not just at the patrol team level, but in the overall response procedures of the era. The note was not intended to assign individual blame, but to document the real-world consequence. If the suspect did in fact put Daniel in the car and took that route, the only realistic chance to stop that journey was lost within the first few minutes. The direct result of this error was that expanding the ground search through the neighborhood became a low-probability effort, because once a child was taken onto the interstate, sweeping the immediate residential area could not possibly uncover traces. Even the K-9 teams fanning out in three directions were limited by distance and time, and could not cover the highway access road before wind, dust, and traffic erased any scent. The deeper impact was how this single misstep shaped the entire remainder of the investigation. Instead of pursuing a vehicle trace strategy, mapping possible routes, and identifying locations the suspect might have stopped, the force was forced back to traditional methods: witness interviews, neighbor canvassing, broader ground searches, all far less effective once the subject had fled by automobile. Ultimately, in the end-of-day summary evaluation, the lead investigator wrote that the I-75 escape gateway was likely utilized in the window before patrol units arrived on scene, and that failure to block the ramps early may have allowed the suspect to travel beyond the distance search teams could realistically reach within the available time frame. This became the first official notation acknowledging that a delayed tactical decision had significantly reduced the chances of recovering the green sedan, and with it, constrained every subsequent investigative step. While police were still reviewing the mistake related to not blocking the entrance to I-75 in time, new tips began pouring in. But instead of helping narrow the scope of the investigation, they made everything more chaotic and scattered over the following 2 weeks. The first and most surprising tip came just one day after the disappearance. A family vacationing in Florida called the hotline to report that they had seen a little boy who looked like Daniel at a gas station near Jacksonville, more than 300 miles from Macon. The caller said the child appeared scared, was with a tall man, driving an older dark-colored car, and something felt off enough to make them suspicious. Florida police were notified immediately, but by the time they arrived, the child and the man were gone, leaving a description too vague to match against anything. One gas station employee suggested the man seemed like the kid's father, while another said the boy was smiling and didn't look scared, creating conflicting accounts. When photos of Daniel were sent down for comparison, the employees said it kind of looked like him, but maybe not, leaving verification at a dead end. Although most of the information was unconvincing, Macon police still had to log the tip and could not immediately rule out a connection, especially since I-75 could realistically get a suspect to Florida in less than a day's drive. The second tip emerged as a fast-spreading rumor in the neighborhood. Several people claimed Daniel had definitely been taken down the highway because they heard a vehicle speeding away around 10 a.m. that morning. The rumor originally came from informal accounts by a few residents near Pine Road, but as it passed from person to person, it turned into what many treated as near certain fact. People started reporting that they heard a car taking off really fast, and some even claimed they saw the shape of a child in the car. But when police followed up door to door, every witness either said they didn't remember clearly, heard it from someone else, or just assumed because everyone was saying it. This chain of unsubstantiated rumors forced investigators to go house by house again to separate actual statements from collectively exaggerated memories. One detective noted in the file that it's extremely difficult to distinguish truth from speculation in a community when rumors travel faster than evidence. The third tip came from a less reliable source. A drunk man at a roadside bar claimed he saw Daniel locked in the trunk of a pickup truck near an auto repair shop. He called the hotline, slurring his words, rambling, and constantly changing his story, first saying the child was locked up, then that the boy was sleeping in the truck, and later that he wasn't even sure it was a child. When police arrived to check, they discovered the man hadn't witnessed anything. He had simply seen a closed truck bed and made up the rest based on neighborhood gossip. Employees at the repair shop confirmed no child had been there all day. Even though the tip was obviously false, police still spent over an hour searching the scene, interviewing the intoxicated man, and writing a report to ensure nothing was missed. Similar incidents kept happening in the days that followed. Someone reported seeing the child at a local market. Another claimed to have heard a child crying near a vacant lot. And one person even said they saw suspicious headlights at the end of the street the night after the disappearance. Every time police checked, they found the same pattern of rumor mixed with mistaken memory. The headlights belonged to a power company truck. The crying came from a family that had just moved in. The child who looked like Daniel at the market was actually a local boy with similar facial features. Each of these checks drained manpower and time and pulled investigators away from more promising leads. The lead investigator noted that in just 2 weeks, more than 30 tips had come in, most of them baseless or filtered through multiple layers of community speculation. Instead of narrowing the search, the flood of tips diluted the investigation and caused it to lose focus. Patrol units had to be split up to handle each report, reducing their ability to concentrate on the green sedan and the suspect directly connected to it. In the summary report at the end of the second week, the investigator wrote clearly that the volume of false tips has seriously scattered our resources, and that if the suspect left the county in the first few hours, these 2 weeks have cost us the critical time advantage. None of the tips led to any concrete trace of Daniel, and every verification effort ended with the same conclusion: the reports were either wrong or unrelated. The wave of false tips over those 2 weeks didn't just disrupt the investigation, it also whipped local media into a frenzy, causing stories about Daniel's disappearance to appear constantly on news sites, radio stations, and morning broadcasts. Macon newspapers ran big headlines like "2-year-old boy vanishes mysteriously," "The green sedan remains an unsolved question," or "Macon on edge, who took Daniel?", making an already anxious public even more tense about missing child cases. That attention quickly turned into pressure as neighbors started openly questioning every possibility, from parental oversight to the idea that someone the family knew might have taken the boy. Some close neighbors visited Evelyn to express concern, but unintentionally said hurtful things like, "If only you'd kept a closer eye on him," or "All it takes is turning away for 1 second." Those well-meaning but blame-heavy comments broke Evelyn down a little more each day, while Howard had to deal with questions from coworkers and acquaintances who were starting to wonder if the family was hiding something the police didn't yet know. A few people in the community, influenced by circulating rumors, even suggested the incident might stem from some internal family conflict, putting the Morrises on the defensive despite their full cooperation with law enforcement. The pressure didn't just land on the family, it weighed heavily on the investigation team too. Reporters constantly camped outside the Morris home, blocked officers coming and going from the scene, and demanded updates on progress, suspects, and when Daniel would be found. The lead detective had to balance giving out limited information to avoid panic while keeping key facts confidential. Many journalists chasing hot stories published their own theories, such as the suspect still being in the area or the child having been taken to neighboring states, which prompted residents to call in with more questions or false sightings. One particularly inflammatory article in the Macon Daily quoted a self-proclaimed expert saying that in many similar missing child cases, the perpetrator is someone known to the family, causing some locals to look at the Morrises with suspicion even though there was zero evidence. Howard faced insinuating questions at work, while Evelyn rarely left the house for fear of being cornered with questions she had no answers to. Police noted that the constant media presence was starting to interfere with the investigation. Witnesses became more reluctant to talk because they didn't want their names in the paper. Residents hesitated to cooperate for fear of appearing on the news, and investigators themselves had to keep dealing with misinformation amplified by the press. In an internal meeting at the end of the second week, the lead detective wrote that media pressure is now beyond our ability to control, and that the family is being further traumatized by community expectations and suspicion. Despite efforts to keep the case professional, the media continued to create an invisible layer of pressure over the entire neighborhood, forcing both the Morris family and the investigators to brace themselves amid increasingly noisy information, with no sign that Daniel was any closer to being found. Amid continuing media pressure and false tips scattering the investigation, the Bibb County Sheriff's Office decided to forward part of Daniel Morris's missing person file to the Federal Bureau of Investigation to evaluate the possibility that the child had been taken across state lines in the first few hours. The process wasn't unusual for missing child cases, but submitting the file to the FBI this early showed the level of concern among local authorities after reviewing the timeline, the green sedan's possible direction, and the likelihood that the suspect could have used I-75 to leave Macon. Once the file reached the FBI office in Atlanta, agents assigned to it reviewed every detail: suspect description, vehicle description, time of disappearance, search radius, witness statements, and the local investigators' assessment that the suspect could have been out of the county in 20 minutes. They agreed that the direct route to I-75 could get a vehicle out of the county in minutes and then either south to Florida or north to Tennessee without hitting any checkpoints that morning. However, the FBI needed concrete evidence to trigger full federal kidnapping protocols, which would include wide-area alerts, additional resources, and activation of the National Alert System, which at that time was still limited. When re-examining information about the green sedan, the FBI found no solid data showing Whitman's car had left Georgia. There were no traffic cameras, no toll booth records of the license plate, and no witnesses confirming the car in any town along the I-75 corridor. Even the Florida tip, while noteworthy, was too unclear to confirm it was Daniel or the vehicle in question. Evaluating these factors under the standards of the era, the FBI concluded the case did not yet meet the threshold for the full federal kidnapping rule, meaning the Bureau could not take over completely or expand the investigation beyond state lines. Instead, they placed Daniel's file in the possible abduction category, a temporary classification for missing child cases that might involve crossing state lines but lack confirming evidence. This allowed the FBI to monitor developments, keep the file in their system, and step in if new data emerged, but it did not trigger large-scale federal resources. That meant primary investigative responsibility remained with the Bibb County Sheriff's Office, with the FBI providing only analytical support and remote oversight. Still, the FBI's preliminary involvement gave the Morris family hope that the case could be expanded beyond local jurisdiction if any evidence surfaced proving Daniel had left Georgia. In reality, however, The FBI's notes indicated there was no physical evidence, no plate, no trace, no image to confirm the suspect's direction of travel. This turned the entire green sedan lead into a reasonable assumption, but one without enough weight to elevate the case to full federal status. One agent wrote in the report that the possibility the child left the state cannot be ruled out, but it also cannot be confirmed at this time, so Daniel's file remained in passive monitoring status. That decision, while procedurally correct, left local authorities carrying the full investigative burden amid chaotic tips, an unclear suspect, and a growingly anxious community. In the final summary sent back to Macon police, the FBI stressed they would keep the case listed as possible abduction and await new information, but all on-the-ground investigative effort would continue to rely on Bibb County forces since no evidence yet showed Daniel had been taken beyond Georgia's borders. After receiving the FBI's response that the case did not yet qualify as a confirmed interstate kidnapping, Bibb County Police refocused on the local level and began systematically checking every individual in the area with any prior record or history involving children. The initial list contained 12 names pulled from court and police records in 3 neighboring counties, ranging from disorderly conduct and minor child endangerment convictions to 2 individuals previously investigated but not charged for attempting to lure minors. The goal was to determine whether any of them matched witness descriptions or had schedules that placed them near the Morris home at the time Daniel vanished. Of the 12, 7 still lived within a 5-mile radius of the Morris residence. Police approached them one by one, starting with the closest addresses. The first was a middle-aged man convicted in 1959 of assaulting his stepchild. He cooperated fully and provided proof that on the morning of the disappearance he was working at a construction site more than 7 miles away, supervised by a foreman, with multiple co-workers confirming his presence from 8 a.m. until noon. The second was a welder previously investigated for hitting a neighbor's child. When police arrived, he was annoyed but produced a clear timeline. He had been working at a garage on the west side of town all morning, backed up by time clock records. The third was an elderly man accused in 1956 of harassing children at a local park, though the case never led to charges. He had stayed home with his wife the morning Daniel disappeared and never left the house. His wife confirmed it, and a next-door neighbor saw him mowing the lawn around 10 a.m. The fourth had once been arrested for trying to coax a child into his car a few years earlier. But records showed it was a misunderstanding when he was simply offering a ride to a friend's kid. Police questioned him thoroughly anyway. He said he had been home caring for his elderly mother that morning, a claim verified by a 9:30 a.m. phone call to their family doctor that police confirmed. The fifth was a young man with a history of causing disturbances at playgrounds. Police located him at his sister's house south of town. 3 family members confirmed he had been sick and stayed inside all morning. The sixth lived on the outskirts of Macon and had a minor record for drunken disorderly conduct and yelling at children. When questioned, he brought pay stubs and a work contract proving he had been at a farm more than 10 miles away all morning. The last of the 7 within the immediate check radius was a man previously warned for watching children near an elementary school. When asked about the morning Daniel disappeared, he stated he was at his brother's house fixing a fence. Police spoke to everyone present that day, and all corroborated his story. After completing the first round of interviews with the 7 individuals still living nearby and cross-referencing their timelines with the exact moment Daniel went missing, police quickly ruled each of them out. None had been close enough to the scene, none drove a green sedan, and none had an unaccounted-for gap in their day remotely, like Whitman's. The remaining 5 names, who no longer lived in the area, were checked through employment records, address changes, and other documentation. 1 had moved out of state 3 years earlier. 1 was currently incarcerated. 2 had verified work records, placing them elsewhere on the day of the disappearance, and the last was confirmed to be staying with relatives in Alabama that day. None owned a vehicle matching the green sedan or had any geographic connection close to the Morris home. The sweep of local offenders confirmed that none of the 12 individuals matched witness descriptions, none had been in the area during the critical time window, and none exhibited behavior even remotely as suspicious as Whitman's. This forced investigators to conclude once again that among everyone with any prior record or history involving children, only Earl Whitman remained the single suspect who could not prove his whereabouts and who perfectly matched both the vehicle description and the witness accounts, making him by far the primary person of interest in the local investigation. After completing a thorough review of all individuals with prior convictions related to children in the area and finding no one who matched the description, police shifted to the next phase, behavioral analysis, to determine the nature of Daniel's disappearance and further narrow the investigative direction. The lead investigator requested the creation of a behavioral classification table based on documented kidnapping patterns from previous years, divided into two major categories: targeted kidnapping and opportunistic kidnapping. To classify the case, police examined the location where Daniel vanished, the neighborhood layout, and the behavioral characteristics of the strange man. The first point in the analysis showed that the Morris family's front yard was fully visible to neighbors and only a few steps from the main road, meaning that if someone intended to carry out a planned abduction, they would have had to scout the location beforehand, monitor the family's daily routine, and choose the moment with the least pedestrian traffic. However, based on Lydia Carter's statement, the strange man only appeared in the neighborhood that morning. There were no prior sightings of him, and the time from when he was first seen to when the green sedan drove away was far too short to suggest long-term planning. Second, in targeted kidnapping models, offenders typically select secluded locations or those with concealed escape routes, whereas the Morris front yard was the most visible spot in the entire block. This made the hypothesis of a carefully prepared abduction far less convincing. Conversely, the behavioral analysis revealed multiple points consistent with opportunistic kidnapping. The suspect appeared suddenly without drawing attention from a distance, observed the area for a few minutes, noticed Daniel in the yard during a 2-3-minute window with no supervision, and acted quickly in that very brief period before Evelyn returned. The fact that the man was standing next to the sedan and appeared to be watching what was happening in the yard suggested he had not arrived with a clear prior intent. Rather, the abduction occurred because a favorable opportunity presented itself, combined with the victim's vulnerability. A key factor that strongly inclined investigators toward the opportunistic model was the suspect's reaction time. According to the timeline, everything from the moment he was first seen to the moment he drove away took place in under 10 minutes. That time frame is too short for a targeted plan but perfectly fits impulsive behavior when an offender suddenly recognizes a rare chance to approach a small child without interference. When reviewing motives in similar child disappearance cases in the southern United States during the 1950s, 1960s, police noted that the majority of opportunistic kidnappings did not involve sexual motives, especially when the victims were as young as Daniel. Investigators further analyzed that if sexual abuse had been the goal, the offender would typically act in a more secluded setting, not in front of a family home in a neighborhood full of potential witnesses. Instead, they assessed that psychological factors were the primary driver in this case. Whitman's profile showed he had experienced multiple job failures, lived in isolation, had no clear family, and frequently changed residences. Similar past cases revealed that some offenders abducted young children to replace a child they had lost or to compensate for feelings of familial emptiness. This led police to hypothesize that, if Whitman was involved, the abduction may have stemmed from an obsession with wanting a child rather than an intent to harm. The analysis table recorded 3 factors supporting the psychological motive hypothesis. The child was very young and easy to control. The approach was rapid with no signs of violence at the scene, and the sedan drove away in an open direction without stopping nearby, indicating the suspect wanted to leave the crime area as quickly and quietly as possible. The investigators' final evaluation in the behavioral classification section stated clearly, The incident bears the characteristic signs of an opportunistic kidnapping, with no long-term preparation, no clear sexual motive, and fits the psychological pattern of seeking emotional replacement in a young victim. This conclusion did not identify the perpetrator definitively, but it helped police better understand the type of behavior they were dealing with and reinforced why Earl Whitman, with his solitary lifestyle, unclear schedule, and presence in the area at the exact time, remained the most prominent name on the suspect list. These initial behavioral assessments helped police establish a rational investigative direction, yet despite both the opportunistic kidnapping model and the psychological factors pointing strongly toward Earl Whitman as the primary suspect, the actual investigation over the following 6 months fell into a state of near-total stagnation. Just weeks after his contradictory police interview, Whitman left town without any official notice, and his departure was confirmed by a neighbor who saw the green sedan leave the house early one morning and never return. Since he was neither charged nor under legal supervision, police had no grounds to stop or track his movements, and when his rental address was found vacant, all efforts to verify a new location yielded no results. This effectively severed surveillance of the main suspect and significantly reduced the ability to gather further information about his behavior or vehicle. During that period, the investigation also recovered no new physical evidence around the Morris home or along suspected routes. No clothing, discarded toys, fresh tracks, or any physical clue that could place Daniel at a specific location was found. Additional periodic searches, conduct every 1 to 2 weeks, expanding the area and using tracking dogs or volunteers, still produced nothing. A few odd items were discovered, such as a small glove or a torn piece of fabric, but testing showed they were unrelated to the case. Witness memories also began to fade over time, making statement cross-checking increasingly difficult. When police re-interviewed Lydia Carter weeks later, she could no longer clearly recall the strange man's posture, only retaining the image of tall and thin, and was uncertain about the color of his shirt or hair. The 12-year-old boy, who had described the green sedan passing by, could no longer confidently confirm the car's speed or direction because his memory had been muddled by conversations with friends and adults in the neighborhood. The truck driver, who thought he saw a child's silhouette in the car, was no longer certain whether it was a reflection or an actual person, given how quickly the glimpse occurred. The fading of witness memories not only weakened existing leads, but also prevented police from building enough credible information to obtain search warrants or pursue Whitman more broadly. At the same time, personnel pressure within the investigative team became evident. After 6 months with no progress, the sheriff's department had to reassign officers to other cases in the county, especially as summertime saw an increase in petty thefts and civil disputes. The original 8-member team was reduced to 3 directly following Daniel's disappearance, severely limiting the ability to process new information, re-interview witnesses, or organize additional searches. Internal reports showed that many requests, such as extra night shifts, expanded vehicle checks, or surveillance of distant areas, were delayed due to lack of manpower and insufficient concrete evidence to convince leadership to prioritize the case. Each piece of the puzzle, from the green sedan and the strange man to scattered tips, became harder to connect as time passed. Many areas previously flagged as suspicious were abandoned due to insufficient personnel to continue checking them. And most critically, Whitman's disappearance, just as suspicion toward him intensified, made an already murky investigative picture even harder to navigate. In the 6-month summary report, the lead investigator wrote, "No new physical evidence has emerged, no new witnesses, no trace of the primary suspect, and no data that alters the behavioral analysis." This was considered the point at which Daniel's disappearance entered its most obvious deadlock since the investigation began, although police continued to keep the file at a monitoring priority level and waited for any lead that might surface. After 6 continuous months of investigation yielding no new traces or data, the Bibb County Sheriff's Office was forced to conduct a comprehensive review of the entire Daniel Morris missing person file to determine whether to maintain active investigation priority or transition to a different handling phase. The review was carried out by the lead investigator along with representatives from 3 departments: Patrol, Criminal Investigation and Administration. The compiled report highlighted the case's greatest weakness: a complete absence of physical evidence, a void that could not be filled despite wide area searches, numerous witness interviews, and screening of individuals with prior records. Nothing belonging to Daniel was left behind, except the toy car found at the outset. There were no impact marks, drag traces, or foreign objects along suspected routes, and most importantly, no physical evidence indicating Daniel had traveled in any specific direction. Data about the green sedan, although matching witness descriptions, relied solely on visual observation: no license plate, no distinctive markings, and no record in the traffic system. The fact that the most significant suspect, Earl Whitman, had left town without a trace left the primary investigative thread unresolved, yet his departure still did not provide sufficient grounds to treat him as the perpetrator, because police lacked direct evidence tying him to the abduction. His contradictory statements carried only suspicious value, not evidentiary weight. Witness files also showed that memories of those present that morning had faded considerably, rendering key details far less reliable than in the initial days. Lydia Carter was no longer certain about the stranger's build. The 12-year-old boy could not confirm the car's direction. The truck driver was unsure whether the silhouette he saw was actually a child. As witness memories became unreliable, police could no longer use those details to generate further investigative pressure or complete search warrants. Manpower dedicated to the case had also dropped significantly, from 8 direct officers to 3, while workload from other county cases continued to rise. This caused many tasks: gathering new information, monitoring outer areas, or following up on scattered tips, to be postponed indefinitely. In the summary meeting, the lead investigator stated that every reasonable avenue had already been pursued: scene searches, route tracing, vehicle tracking, witness investigation, local offender screening, and behavioral analysis. None had produced new data in the most recent 3 months. Under Bibb County standards at the time, a missing person case remained in active investigation status only if leads had emerged within the past 3 months, or if there was firm reason to believe the suspect was still operating in the area. Daniel's case no longer met these criteria and therefore could not retain priority status. In the report submitted to department leadership, the investigator recommended transferring the file to unsolved status, a form of temporary closure for cases lacking data for continued proactive investigation. This decision did not mean the case was abandoned, rather it moved to long-term storage, where the file would be retained intact and re-examined if new leads appeared or investigative technology advanced. After approval, Daniel Morris's file was transferred to the county's cold case unit, which handles unsolved cases for storage, periodic review, and processing upon new information. Before handover, the lead investigator added a significant note: the file cannot progress further without new physical evidence or witnesses. The primary suspect left the area without breaking any law during the investigation period, and current data is insufficient to request expanded investigative authority. Transferring the file to unsolved status closed the 6-month active investigation phase, marking an unwanted but unavoidable turning point due to the complete absence of signals to move the case forward. In the first decade after Daniel Morris's file was reclassified as unsolved, the case did not sink into total silence. Scattered leads occasionally surfaced, forcing authorities to reopen the file, cross-check information, and ultimately dismiss everything due to lack of reliable verification tools. Reports of sightings of Daniel arrived regularly from 1965 to 1974, but most fell into common false positive patterns in child disappearance cases. Mistaken facial resemblance, floating memories, random physical coincidences, and influence from old news articles that made people believe they could help solve the case. One of the earliest tips came from a small town in southern Georgia when a woman reported that a child playing in a park looked very much like Daniel. When police arrived, they found it was the son of a local family, with only coincidental similarities in hairstyle and facial structure. Another tip from South Carolina described a 3 to 4-year-old boy with a mole near his ear, a detail that prompted serious checking, but photos sent back showed the child bore no real resemblance beyond that minor mark. Each similar report required police to contact local authorities, check child records, and compare identifying features, even though most were quickly ruled out. The most notable tip arrived in 1968, when an Alabama officer reported a boy, approximately 4 to 5 years old, abandoned in front of a church in Montgomery, who shared several facial features with Daniel at the time of disappearance. Bibb County immediately sent personnel with photos and detailed descriptions for comparison. Upon meeting the child in person, however, the differences were immediately obvious: slightly darker hair, mismatched jaw structure, and a small birthmark on the neck that Daniel did not have. Still, for thoroughness, they photographed the boy and sent the images back to headquarters for further reference. Manual comparison with Daniel's photos, a process that took many days, confirmed it was not the same child. Though both knew the pain was what made them act this way, they could find no way to rebuild the strong bond they had once shared before the tragedy. The pressure stretched across years, turning them into two strangers trapped in the same house. By 1974, 10 years after the disappearance, Howard's health had deteriorated severely. His first heart attack occurred while he was working at the woodshop. Although he survived it, his spirit was completely broken, and the distance between him and Evelyn grew even wider. 1 year later, in the summer of 1975, Howard died after a second heart attack, leaving Evelyn alone with a grief over her missing son that had never eased. Her husband's death made Evelyn cling even more tightly to the fragile hope that Daniel was still alive somewhere, because now that hope was the last thread connecting her to a bearable future. After Howard passed, Evelyn continued to stay in regular contact with the Bibb County Cold Case Unit. Every year she called at least twice to ask whether any new leads had come in, and every time she received the same answer: nothing had changed. Even so, Evelyn maintained the habit of collecting every newspaper article, photograph, and piece of information about missing children that she thought might be Daniel. In their new home, she kept a large box filled with papers, pictures, and notes, an act of desperate preservation to hold on to memory and to any possibility at all. Over time, she grew quieter, avoiding social contact, but she never stopped reaching out to the police. Some of the younger detectives who joined in the 1970s were surprised to receive calls from a mother who remained so persistent after so many years. But they understood that for Evelyn, continuing to call was the only way to keep Daniel alive on paper and prevent the case from slipping into total oblivion. And it was precisely that persistence that ensured Daniel Morris's file, despite no progress, remained under periodic review by the Cold Case Unit, awaiting something no one at the time knew would take many more decades to arrive. Toward the end of the 1970s, while Evelyn was still regularly contacting the Bibb County Sheriff's Office about any leads on Daniel, the Cold Case Unit reviewed old files related to Earl Whitman and noticed a scattered trail showing that he had left Georgia not long after disappearing from Macon. Administrative records from that era were sparse, but enough remained to show that Whitman had registered a temporary residence in a small town in eastern Tennessee just a few months after Daniel went missing. The first address on record was a rented house on the edge of town, no information about anyone living with him, no vehicle plate listed, only a brief note that the tenant was a male, around 30 years old, who paid cash for the first 6 months. When Tennessee authorities were later contacted, Some old records indicated Whitman had taken a job at a small woodworking shop on the outskirts of town, similar work to what he had done in Georgia, but on a smaller, lesser-known scale. The shop recorded him as a hard worker but sullen. He always arrived on time, yet hardly spoke to anyone. The former manager described Whitman as quiet, did basic work well but never fit in. Employment records also showed he did not stay long. After about a year and a half, he left the shop without notice and without collecting his final paycheck, vanishing in the same way he had left Georgia. During his time in Tennessee, a few scattered reports from local residents noted incidents involving Whitman and children, though none were serious enough to result in arrest or charges. One report from 1970 stated that a woman living a few houses away had seen Whitman talking to a young boy outside the grocery store in a way that seemed off, but when police followed up, she could not describe it clearly, and the child had already left with his mother. The incident was marked insufficient grounds because no other witness corroborated it. Another report from 1972 mentioned a neighborhood child telling his mother that the neighbor man asked me to come over and play, but when the mother was questioned further, she would not confirm the child was accurate, saying her son liked to make things up, and Whitman completely denied it. Tennessee investigators reviewing the files also found no evidence that Whitman ever owned or cared for a child, though records from that era were not detailed enough to rule it out definitively. One more vague case, in 1973, involved a store owner suggesting Whitman had once carried a small child into the shop for a few minutes, but no one could identify the child. When the owner was re-interviewed years later, he admitted his memory was no longer clear, and he might confuse Whitman with another customer, since the small store often had parents bringing children in. These fragmentary bits of information were not enough to prove criminal behavior, but taken together, they showed Whitman did not live in complete isolation as his outward appearance suggested. The man moved through multiple temporary addresses, left no lasting trace, maintained no social ties, and was repeatedly described by those around him with phrases like odd, unpredictable, or something not quite right, but hard to pin down. Years later, when the Bibb County Cold Case Unit compiled records from both Georgia and Tennessee, they noted that Whitman's changes of residence followed a hard-to-track pattern. He never stayed anywhere longer than 2 years, never achieved financial stability, often left suddenly without warning, and always chose small, isolated towns or communities accustomed to not asking too many questions. That pattern made tracing him extremely difficult in the 1960s and 1970s, when records were not centrally stored and no nationwide database existed as it does today. One noteworthy entry in the Tennessee file, added in 1974, came from a social worker who had indirect contact with Whitman through a low-income assistance program. The worker described him as showing mild mood swings, easily agitated when questioned about personal matters, but no clear violent behavior. The report also noted that he consistently avoided questions about family or relatives, a detail that matched earlier descriptions from Georgia. Although none of these traces were sufficient to conclude anything regarding Daniel, they painted a consistent picture of Whitman, a solitary man, constantly on the move, socially evasive, and occasionally observed in situations involving young children that could never be fully verified. When Bibb County received these Tennessee records in the late 1970s, investigators could only conclude in their report that the Tennessee information does not establish criminal conduct, but reinforces Whitman's pattern of unstable behavior. It was an important piece that helped them better understand his sudden disappearance from Georgia and why tracing him had remained so difficult for years afterward. Nearly 3 decades after Daniel vanished, when everything known about Earl Whitman existed only as faded notes and scattered traces from his time in Tennessee, the Bibb County Cold Case Unit received an anonymous call in the late 1990s. The caller was a middle-aged man who spoke softly, hesitantly, and seemed to be trying to avoid identification. He claimed that Daniel Morris, the child missing since 1964, is still alive and is in Tennessee, not far from where Whitman used to live. When asked how he knew, the man said only that he had seen a man who looked like Daniel as a boy, and heard people in town say a child had been brought here years ago, with no one knowing where he came from. But when the investigator asked for a name, specific address or clear timeline, the caller began to dodge, managing only to give one street name, Maple Hollow Road. Immediately afterward, the call ended. Unclear whether he hung up or the connection was lost. Despite the vagueness and lack of any verifiable detail, Cold Case logged the call because it matched old records in a striking way. Whitman had once lived not far from an area listed as Hollow in his Tennessee rental file. Though the coincidence could have been pure chance, it was enough to convince the unit to send a team for an on-site verification. The first time in many years they had received a tip mentioning Tennessee, the same place where scattered records had once hinted at Whitman's vague interactions with children. A two-person investigative team spent 3 days in Tennessee, bringing the original file, photos of Daniel taken at the time of his disappearance, and old witness descriptions. The only address they had was Maple Hollow Road, a stretch more than a mile long running through sparse residential areas dotted with old wooden houses, empty lots, and small pine woods. Once there, they canvassed every home within a half-mile radius, knocking on doors, explaining their purpose, and asking whether anyone remembered a child appearing with no clear origin in the late 1960s or early 1970s. Most current residents of Maple Hollow Road had moved in within the past 10-15 years. Those who had lived there longer could not clearly recall old neighborhood families from decades earlier. One man in his 60s said he did not remember any family that suddenly brought a child, but he had heard from relatives that Whitman used to live somewhere around here long ago. When pressed for details, however, he only knew the story secondhand, with no specific address or behavior involving children. An older woman who had lived on the road for over 30 years vaguely recalled a reclusive family at the far end of the road in the early 1970s, but she could not remember whether they had children or how long they stayed. When asked the family's name, she simply shook her head, saying people came and went so often back then that no one could keep track. The investigation grew difficult when the team realized many of the old houses on Maple Hollow Road had been torn down or changed hands multiple times over 3 decades, making it impossible to pinpoint any specific address the anonymous caller might have meant. They visited the local library to search old census records, but the records from that period were incomplete. Some pages lost in a small fire years earlier, others listing only property owners and not temporary renters like Whitman. The two investigators continued by speaking to owners of nearby grocery stores, gas stations, and auto shops, asking whether anyone had ever heard of a child of unknown origin appearing in the area during the 1960s or 1970s. One auto shop owner said his mother had once mentioned some weird guy who lived around here long before I was born, but he was unsure if it was Whitman, since the area had seen many seasonal workers come and go without trace. Others said that if a child with no clear background had shown up back then, they would have known, because it was a small, tight-knit community where neighbors knew one another well. Their memories, however, were more speculative than factual. For deeper verification, the investigators checked enrollment lists from nearby elementary schools in the early 1970s. Every record required parent or guardian information, none matched Morris or Whitman, and no child was recorded as enrolling without proper documentation. This ruled out the possibility that Daniel had ever attended the local public school. On the final day of the trip, they returned to Maple Hollow Road to examine the far end where the older woman had mentioned an isolated family. They located the foundation of an old wooden house long since demolished, but no one knew who had lived there. A nearby resident said the house had been abandoned even before he moved in 1985. With no physical evidence, no direct witnesses, and no matching residency records, the team ultimately concluded that the anonymous call, while attention-grabbing, produced no concrete leads. In their summary report back to the Bibb County office, the investigators wrote, "No verifiable evidence links the tip to Daniel Morris." All information is vague, reliant on distant memory, and does not generate a new investigative direction. The late 1990 Sud anonymous call, though it briefly sparked hope, ended up as just another disconnected fragment, not enough to reopen active investigation, and certainly not enough to confirm that Daniel had ever actually been in Tennessee. When the late 1990 Sud anonymous call yielded no verifiable data, the Bibb County Cold Case Unit returned to what they already knew about Earl Whitman. Because after so many years, he remained the only name in the entire file whose behavior and timeline aligned with Daniel's disappearance. The investigator handling the case rebuilt a comparative timeline of Whitman's movements against the sequence of events on the morning Daniel vanished to see whether the scattered details gathered over decades pointed to a consistent pattern. Records from 1964 showed Whitman lived just a few blocks from the Morris home, owned a green sedan matching witness descriptions, and most critically, had a schedule that placed him leaving his house within the exact window when Daniel disappeared. One neighbor had seen him drive away between approximately 9:40 and 10 o'clock a.m., the precise time frame Daniel vanished from the front yard. Minutes later, a green sedan was observed by a young witness speeding through the area. That matched the truck driver's statement about seeing a small figure in the front passenger seat of a similar car. When all these timestamps were plotted on the same chart, the investigator realized that if Whitman had left just 3-4 minutes earlier, or appeared near the scene 2-3 minutes later, none of the leads would line up. It was the very precision of the events that made Whitman the strongest suspect. Every small vague piece snapped into a logical timeline when placed together. Meanwhile, no one else in the area was present during that critical window, and no one else owned a vehicle matching the witness's descriptions. Digging deeper into behavior, the cold case investigator compiled all available data on how Whitman had acted during his years in both Georgia and Tennessee. One thing stood out clearly: he lived alone, had no known family ties, left no clear social footprint, and held short-term jobs that changed frequently. There was no evidence of violence, yet there were repeated vague reports involving children, talking to a boy outside a grocery store, allegedly carrying a small child into an auto shop, or being suspected of approaching neighborhood kids and then denying it. Though none of the incidents led to charges, the pattern showed Whitman did not avoid children the way a typical solitary adult male might. The investigator asked the larger question: what motive could a man like Whitman, no family, no ties, have for taking a 2-year-old child? Searching older records, they uncovered a note from Whitman's early life in Alabama. He had once had a son, around 3 years old, who died of illness when Whitman was just over 20. Few details existed about the event, but the investigator noted the child's death occurred amid a failed marriage, and shortly afterward, Whitman began his decades-long pattern of drifting, moving state to state, taking temporary jobs. Though no formal psychological profile from that era existed, the behavioral pattern suggested a possibility. Whitman may have carried an emotional void or trauma from losing his own child, and if he did abduct Daniel, the motive might have been substitution, a form of psychological compensation, rather than harm. Looking at the case from this angle, the investigators saw that the scene showed no signs of violence, no damaged evidence, and Daniel disappeared in complete silence. No cries, no signs of struggle. All of it fit the profile of a perpetrator who wanted to take the child without hurting him. The opposite of abductions driven by sexual or predatory motives. Another factor supporting this view was the way Whitman left Georgia. No drama. No accusations, just quietly vanishing from town shortly after being questioned by police. That is classic behavior of a suspect afraid of discovery, but without an elaborate escape plan. When Whitman was compared to every other person in the file, no one else came close to matching opportunity, timing, means, and behavioral pattern. Even the scattered Tennessee reports throughout the 1960s and 1970s showed Whitman appearing in unusual contexts near children, keeping him the single recurring focal point among vague but repeated data points. When all of these analyses were compiled into the cold case report, the investigator concluded, if judged by feasibility based on timing, geography, behavior, and means, Earl Whitman is the primary and sole suspect with logical connection to all known facts. No other subject meets a comparable level of alignment. Solidifying Whitman as the strongest suspect did not advance the investigation at that time, but it served as the foundation for Daniel Morris's file to remain alive and periodically reviewed in the years that followed, rather than being permanently archived with no chance of ever being reopened. As the reanalysis of Whitman's behavior continued to reinforce that he was the strongest suspect, the cold case unit decided to expand the scope of historical data screening in Tennessee, focusing particularly on the period immediately following the disappearance, 1964 to 1966. The time when Whitman had left Georgia and began appearing sporadically in population records in eastern Tennessee. Their goal was to find any sign of a child suddenly appearing in the area, an unusual demographic change, or a civil record that did not match the family patterns of that era. While examining birth, death records, and birth certificates stored in the 3 counties where Whitman had been recorded as present, investigators discovered that the 1964-1966 period had many data gaps because paper records from that time were stored inconsistently. Some counties had detailed logs, but smaller ones only kept officially registered records, missing many cases of home births, late notifications, or those not registered on time. This forced the cold case team to also examine secondary documents, church registries, vaccination logs, preschool enrollment records, small hospital logs, and notes from religious organizations that assisted struggling families. It was during the review of these secondary sources that they noticed an unusual detail: the records of a family with the surname Granger on the outskirts of Roane County. According to the local church's enrollment ledger, in 1965, this family suddenly had an additional child, approximately 2 years old, named Michael Granger, listed among the children attending Sunday activities. What caught the investigators' attention was not the appearance of the child itself, but the fact that there was no birth record whatsoever for the boy in the entire system of the 3 neighboring counties. When cross-referencing with the health department's vaccination records, Michael's name also appeared starting in 1965, but the mother field was left blank with only a dash instead of a name and no corresponding birth record code. The place of birth field was completely empty, an extremely rare occurrence even for the rudimentary records of the 1960s. Investigators dug deeper. The local preschool's 1966 records listed Michael's starting attendance with a brief note, "Child cared for by the Granger family, additional paperwork to be submitted later." But that additional paperwork was never submitted. When the cold case unit contacted the old church facility for more information, current administrators only knew that the Granger family had moved away from the area in the late 1970s. No one left in the community could confirm whether Michael was the family's biological child. One elderly woman, the only person still alive who had known the Grangers, only remembered that they adopted a little boy or someone left him with them. But she could not recall where the boy came from or remember any relatives ever mentioning the mother. When pressed further, she simply said the boy didn't look like anyone in the family. Investigators reviewed property records and uncovered another detail. The Granger family had moved to Tennessee in 1963, had no local relatives, and worked as traveling salespeople. The fact that they suddenly had an additional child in 1965 with no legal paperwork whatsoever led investigators to ask, was Michael Granger truly their biological child, or a child brought to them through unofficial means? In that era, informal adoptions without legal process were still fairly common in small towns, but most such cases still left some trace: a handwritten letter, a church note, or a temporary confirmation. Here, there was nothing. The data was completely blank. When comparing Michael's age in 1965, investigators noted the boy was recorded as approximately 2 years old, with no official birth date. This matched Daniel's age if the boy had been brought to Tennessee within a few months of disappearing. However, the match was purely hypothetical due to the absence of core information, no photographs, no detailed medical information, and no birth certificate to compare. The data gaps from 1964 to 1966 left every hypothesis in a gray area. Nevertheless, the cold case unit flagged the Granger family case as a significant anomaly. The first time in many years they had found a family with a child of unclear origin appearing exactly in the period and area where Whitman had lived. But with thin records, no one left to interview, and no DNA technology available at the time, they were forced to conclude that there is no conclusive evidence to determine Michael Granger is connected to the disappearance of Daniel Morris, and everything once again sank into the prolonged silence of an unsolved case file. Throughout the 1970s to the late 1980s, while the Tennessee leads remained too vague to become an official investigative direction, the Morris family, now only Evelyn left, continued an unbroken ritual once every year. She submitted a request to the Bibb County Sheriff's Office asking them to review Daniel's missing person file again. Though the content of the letters changed over time, sometimes several pages long, sometimes just a short paragraph, they all carried the same tone, urgent, heartfelt, and never diminishing in hope that one day the truth would be found. Evelyn always reiterated 3 points. The case remained unsolved, Daniel had never been found, and any new data, no matter how small, could make a difference. Each time a letter arrived, the cold case unit reopened the file, reviewed the old notes, and checked whether any tips related to the case had come in during the past year, or if any unidentified child cases needed cross-referencing. However, the persistent lack of data prevented the investigators from reopening the case on a full scale. They remained confined to the information framework of the 1960s, no physical evidence, no biological samples, no license plates, no hospital or school records to compare, and no longer any witnesses with clear enough memories to provide new data. Some younger investigators who joined in the 1980s noted that reading the file felt like looking at a puzzle with too many missing pieces, making it nearly impossible to reconstruct the timeline or trace suspect behavior. Still, per cold case procedure, every letter from Evelyn required them to perform at least a minimum review, re-verifying the statewide missing persons list, checking reports of unidentified children in neighboring counties, comparing cases of children adopted without proper paperwork, and re-screening original records from 1964, 1966. Each time, the result was the same, no new data to act on. One veteran investigator wrote in an internal report, "Every letter from Mrs. Morris is a reminder that we haven't finished the job, but we have no tools to go further." Many in the department understood that Evelyn kept sending the letters not only out of hope, but also out of fear. Fear that if she stopped reminding them, the case would fade completely into oblivion, and Daniel, whether alive or not, would disappear from the memory of those responsible. Evelyn's persistence had a quiet but tangible effect. The Daniel Morris file, instead of being buried deep like many other old missing persons cases, always remained in the group of files reviewed periodically. This could not advance the investigation, but it kept the case from being permanently closed. In many phone conversations, investigators had to tell Evelyn they were sorry, but there was no new information. Each time she replied in a steady yet resolute voice that she understood and would keep waiting. Even when her health declined in the late 1980s, Evelyn still had relatives help her write and send the letters to police, never missing a single year. Those letters, though unable to reopen the case due to lack of information, still prompted the police to add notes to the file stating family continues to request review and case remains in active monitoring status. Evelyn's tenacity kept the Daniel Morris case alive across decades, a thin file, empty of data but never permanently shelved, even though law enforcement, in reality, had no way to fully reopen the investigation without new leads to follow. The first official record, bearing the name Michael Granger, appeared in the summer of 1966, in the Roane County, Tennessee Health Department's vaccination log, recording a boy approximately 3 years old, brought in for the first shot in the standard immunization series. That entry became the starting marker for the entire life that Daniel Morris, unaware he was Daniel, would live under a different identity. There was no information whatsoever in Michael's records about the period from birth to age 2. The date of birth field was filled with an estimate, not the real date. The place of birth field was completely blank. The mother's name field was replaced by a single dash, something rare even in provisional 1960s records. In that vaccination record, only one person was listed as guardian, Robert Granger, living with his wife Helen Granger, in a wooden house at the end of Maple Hollow Road. It was in that house that Daniel, under the name Michael, spent his entire childhood without ever knowing where he came from and with no memory of his real name. The Granger family was not violent, but they were so insular that a child raised in that home would never learn much about the outside world. Robert was a quiet man who worked seasonally on farms and at sawmills. Helen was a reserved woman who kept the kitchen spotless, the doors closed, and avoided neighbors. Michael, actually Daniel, lived on a fixed routine, mornings doing small chores, afternoons playing in the front yard or the pine woods behind the house, evenings eating early dinner and going to bed before full dark in winter. The Grangers never explained much about the boy's origins. When he was very young, Michael didn't ask questions. He only knew he lived with Mama Helen and Papa Robert, the names he was taught as soon as he could speak. But when he reached 5, then 6, the age when children start noticing differences between their family and others, Michael began to sense irregularities he couldn't explain. The first irregularity was that there were never any stories about when he was a baby. Other children heard their parents talk about their first steps, first words, or first illness. But in the Granger house, whenever he asked, "What was I like when I was little?" Robert would answer curtly, "Same as now." Helen was gentler but still evasive. "You came to Mama when you were very small. That's enough." There were never any photos of Michael before age 3. No birthday pictures, church pictures, or family photos. In the old drawer where Helen kept papers, Michael once rummaged and found only unmarked envelopes, a few loose bills, and a 1963 application for temporary housing, nothing indicating he had ever existed in their lives before 1966. The second irregularity was how adults in town reacted whenever the past was mentioned. When Michael was 6, he once overheard 2 neighbors say, "That kid doesn't look like his parents at all." One said, it was normal because many families took in children without full paperwork. The other replied, "But the Grangers are strange. They never say where he came from." When Michael asked Helen about it, she simply said, "Some things you don't need to know." Her tone wasn't angry, but final, as if asking questions was forbidden. After that, he asked less, but curiosity mixed with a feeling of not belonging grew year by year. On another occasion, around age 7, Michael curiously opened the small old safe in Robert's bedroom, a box he had often seen locked with a brass key. Inside were just a few old bills, a pocket knife, and a stack of crumpled papers. Among them was a strange form that looked like a temporary care request from a religious organization. The child received section had been scribbled over in pencil with a single letter, possibly an M, then erased. The date was vague, the year unclear. When Robert discovered Michael looking at the papers, he snatched them away and slammed the safe so hard, Michael jumped. That night, no one in the house said another word. From that moment, Michael understood there was something in his past he was absolutely not allowed to know. The third irregularity was that Michael had no birth certificate like other children. When he started first grade in 1970, Helen submitted to the school a packet consisting of the vaccination record, the home address, and a piece of paper signed by the local pastor stating child is under the guardianship of the Granger family. When the teacher asked for the birth certificate, Helen simply replied, "We don't have one." The boy was sent to us by a distant relative. The school accepted it because paperwork wasn't as strict then as it is now, but Michael heard that answer and knew something was wrong. A 6-year-old didn't understand the full legal meaning, but he clearly understood the feeling of having something important hidden from him. In the years that followed, whenever he saw other children his age, carrying family photos or talking about when their parents were young, Michael felt even more different. He had no medical history, no real birthday, no visiting relatives, no origin stories. Just a quiet, closed-off Granger family, and a life confined within the narrow boundaries of a house at the end of a dirt road. Though those irregularities appeared only as small fragments in a child's awareness, they gradually formed a deep feeling that Michael's life, or rather Daniel's life, did not begin where he was living. All of his real memories started only from age 3 onward, as if everything before had been erased. But he still didn't know that those gaps were not random. They were the only remaining traces of a disappearance buried for decades. As he entered his teenage years and then adulthood, Daniel, still carrying the name Michael Granger, continued living a life where the childhood gaps never disappeared. They were simply covered by the ingrained silence of the Granger family. He attended Roane County High School, a small school where most students had known each other since childhood. Michael was an average but diligent student, neither outstanding nor troublesome. He was quiet and reserved, like Robert, yet possessed the caution and observational skill he absorbed from Helen. Still, he never felt fully integrated with friends who grew up in big families or with nearby relatives. When friends talked about their early years, first birthdays, which hospital they were born in, who held them when they were born, Michael stayed silent. Each time he felt like he was standing outside a circle that every other child belonged to. During high school, a few times teachers required students to submit family medical history forms, heart conditions, allergies, hereditary diseases, and Michael could submit nothing beyond a simple handwritten note. No infant medical history available. This was the same answer repeated for years, and each time he handed it in, he knew it wasn't normal. When he asked Helen, "Was I sick when I was born? Where was I born?" she only replied, "You've been healthy since I took you in. That's enough." The answer was identical to her responses when he was small, final, closing every door. Robert was even blunter. Any question about the time before age 3 was dismissed with "Don't dig up old things." That avoidance made Michael gradually stop asking, but it didn't reduce the suspicion in his heart. After graduating high school, Michael held various jobs, helping at an auto shop, laboring at the lumber yard, then driving delivery for a local company. He had no ambition to leave Tennessee or attend college, partly because of family circumstances, partly because he felt he didn't belong anywhere else. Many people described him as gentle but private, reluctant to share personal stories, and always keeping a certain distance. In his 20s, Michael married a local woman named Linda, the first person who made him feel he could open up. Linda was cheerful, outgoing, and came from a family in the next town over, the complete opposite of the heavy silence in the Granger house. But even after marriage, questions of identity never left Michael. Once, while filling out marriage license paperwork, the biological parents' names field made him freeze for several seconds. Linda gently asked, "You okay?" Michael just nodded, but that night he lay awake. How can a grown man not know his real birthday, real birthplace, or who his biological parents are? When Linda became pregnant with their first child, doctors asked for Michael's family medical history. Once again, Michael could only give the repeated answer, "No infant medical records." The doctor was surprised because that was rare. Linda asked Michael whether the Grangers had ever said anything about when he was little. Michael simply replied, "No, they never said." That years-long silence began to feel like a burden as he prepared to become a father. He started trying to uncover his past, asking Helen again about the year he was taken in. Helen answered briefly, "Someone brought you to us, we raised you as our own, end of story." Michael asked, "Who brought me?" Helen was silent for a long time, then just shook her head. In a rare moment, she admitted, "I don't remember, it's been so many years," but Michael knew she remembered. She just didn't want to say or couldn't say. Robert had passed away earlier, so all answers came only from Helen, and they were all empty. He tried searching the old safe again, but after Robert died, Helen had taken the key and never opened it again. The more Michael thought about it, the more his life felt like a book with the first chapter torn out. No birth certificate, no baby photos, no story at all about how he came to the Granger family. And what worried him most were the times he wandered through childhood memories, trying to retrieve any fragment before age 3, but finding nothing. He once risked asking his mother directly, "Am I your real son?" Helen just placed her hand on his and gave one single answer. "I love you like my own flesh and blood." But that wasn't the truth he was looking for. Throughout adulthood, Michael often felt something was off in his life, as if his very existence rested on an incomplete story. He didn't know that the missing pieces weren't hidden by the Grangers out of shame or hardship, but because his origin lay beyond anything they could explain. He didn't know that the very absence, nameless papers, vague stories, blank record fields, was the last trace of a life torn from its roots at age 2. And throughout those adult years, Michael lived without ever knowing that his true identity, Daniel Morris, was waiting to be reclaimed hundreds of miles away, in old files that his birth mother still persistently asked to be reopened every single year. When he turned 50, Michael, who had never known that he was in fact Daniel Morris, began facing health issues that doctors believed might be linked to genetic factors. After a routine checkup, the doctor recommended that Michael undergo an expanded DNA test to assess his genetic risk for cardiovascular diseases, since he showed signs of mild arrhythmia and cyclically elevated blood pressure. For an ordinary person, this type of test mainly served the purpose of predicting risks, but for Michael, it carried a different meaning. This was the first time in his life he had a chance to learn about his own genetics, something he had never known for nearly 50 years. Linda, his wife, who always worried about her husband's health, encouraged him to do the test because she wanted to know whether there were any risks that could affect their daughter and grandchildren. Michael agreed, partly for medical reasons, partly because of the questions that had quietly smoldered inside him from childhood to adulthood, about identity, about origins, about having no newborn medical records at all. He took a mouth swab sample and sent it to a commercial laboratory that specialized in DNA analysis, combining medical data and genealogy. This company not only ran the medical test, but also automatically uploaded the DNA data into its genealogy system, a massive database that connected DNA samples from various companies to help people find distant relatives, cross-reference family trees, or determine ancestral origins. At first, Michael was only interested in the medical risk analysis section. A few weeks later, he received the report, which noted he had a moderately high risk for cardiovascular disease and hypertension, but nothing overly serious. However, at the end of the report, there was a footnote. The genealogy system has found multiple potential DNA connections. Please log into your account to view details. Michael had never cared about that section, but Linda encouraged him. You might find some distant relatives. Haven't you wondered your whole life who you really are? When he logged in, Michael saw a list of dozens of weak DNA connections, relatives so distant they meant nothing. Then he noticed one entry at the top of the list, highlighted in light red, likely second or third degree relative, the name Anna Morris. Michael felt his heart pound when he saw that surname. Morris. He didn't know why it stopped him in his tracks, but the feeling was like a familiar shadow suddenly appearing at the end of a dark hallway. The system continued listing other names: Rebecca Morris, James Morris, Andrew Morris. All were marked with the same relationship group within close or immediate family range. A small note appeared beside them. Data suggests very high genetic compatibility with the Morris family group in Georgia. Michael scrolled further and saw the detailed analysis: probability of direct blood relation, 98.7%. Likely first or second degree relative to one or more individuals in the Morris group. He sat motionless for a long time, staring at the list of names without knowing what to do. He had never heard of the Morris family, nor met anyone with that surname in his life. But what unsettled him even more was another system note. User may be an individual who lost contact with birth family at a young age. The software knew nothing about the 1964 disappearance. It was only working from probability algorithms based on DNA and genealogy data. Yet that suggestion felt like someone had tightened a grip around his chest. He clicked into each person's information. Anna Morris, 60 years old, living in Georgia. Rebecca, 58 years old, also Georgia. James, 35 years old, listed as cousin. The more he looked, the harder his heart pounded. The list formed an almost dense DNA network, all centered around a Morris family in Georgia, a place he had never visited in his entire adult life. Linda, standing behind him reading along, whispered, "Michael, what do you think this means?" Michael couldn't answer. He just silently stared at the DNA connection lines on the screen, lines that signaled blood ties he had never known existed. Then he looked again at the entry. No newborn medical history available in his own medical file, a sentence that had followed him for more than half a century. For the first time in his life, Michael felt that the answer he had been seeking for so long was no longer in Helen's silence or the foggy past of the Granger family, but in his own genetic code. DNA doesn't lie, and it had just found a door he never thought could be opened. The Morris family. Georgia. A blood connection deeper than anything Michael had ever been told about his life. And from that moment, everything he believed to be true about his past began to crumble. When Michael's DNA was flagged by the genealogy system as having an extremely high match with multiple members of the Morris family, the information did not remain merely personal. One of the Morris relatives, specifically Rebecca Morris, Evelyn's granddaughter, had created a DNA account years earlier as part of a family genealogy project. When the system sent Rebecca a notification of an unusually strong DNA connection, she paid immediate attention because the Morris family had kept the habit of updating distant relative data in the hope of finding any clue related to Daniel. Rebecca opened the email and saw the alert, a second to third degree DNA connection with a user named Michael Granger. The match was abnormally high, 98.7%, a figure that had never appeared in any previous comparison. What stunned Rebecca even more was a small algorithmic note determining the degree of relation. User most likely belongs to the generation equivalent to a child or grandchild of a Morris family member. Rebecca sat in silence for a long time. Since childhood she had heard the story of Daniel's disappearance, the 2-year-old boy who vanished from the yard in 1964, an open wound that never healed in the family. Evelyn had retold that story dozens of times, writing to the police every year. And now, almost by chance, the genealogy system had produced a DNA result so strong it could only belong to immediate family. Rebecca immediately called the Bibb County Sheriff's Office, where Daniel Morris's file had been gathering dust in cold cases for nearly half a century. The dispatcher transferred the call to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation because, since the 1990s, long-term missing persons cases with potential reappearance elements had been overseen by the GBI rather than individual county departments. When the GBI received the information from the commercial DNA system, they instantly classified the lead as high priority because the genetic match exceeded normal thresholds. An investigator with the GBI in Atlanta, Caleb Rourke, who specialized in cold case victim identification through DNA, took the notification. Caleb had handled dozens of similar cases. But as soon as he read the DNA report, he knew this was not routine. The extremely high match and the link to the Morris family, who had a decades-old missing child case, prompted Caleb to flag the matter as a critical match, requiring response within 48 hours. Caleb pulled the original file from Bibb County through the Federal Archive system and looked at the 1964 report, faded photocopies, typewritten text, documenting the disappearance of a 2-year-old boy named Daniel Morris. The entire timeline, details about the green sedan, witness list, and notes on suspect Earl Whitman were all there, neatly contained in a thick, yellowed, nearly 300-page folder. Caleb read the summary in one sitting and recognized it as a classic child abduction case from the era, No physical evidence, no DNA, no license plate, an investigation that by 1960s standards was almost unsolvable. But now everything had changed. They had DNA, an undeniable trace. In his intake report, Caleb wrote, "Probability of direct blood relation, extremely high. Probability that the DNA sample belongs to the missing victim or a direct descendant of the Morris family." Once a file reached this classification, the GBI had authority to fully reopen the case, even after more than 50 years. Caleb contacted Rebecca to verify the data. He asked for details about the family tree, identified branches that could be relevant, and confirmed individuals who might be full or half-siblings of Daniel or their children. Rebecca confirmed that no one else in the Morris family had ever gone missing besides Daniel, and every other person in the tree had clear birth records. That made the conclusion obvious. If Michael Granger's DNA matched this strongly, there were only two possibilities. He was Daniel, or he was Daniel's biological child, which was impossible, since Daniel disappeared at age 2. Caleb immediately requested an order to reopen the cold case. The process involved uploading all digitized documents into the modern system, re-examining every old piece of evidence, even if it no longer had legal value, re-screening criminal records of anyone previously involved, including Earl Whitman, and requesting civil registry files from Tennessee for the 1964-1966 period to recover any previously overlooked data. In an internal GBI meeting memo, Caleb stated clearly, "This DNA connection is the clearest lead in the entire case since the day of the disappearance. It cannot be coincidence. The DNA carrier has a direct blood relationship with the Morris family. The case must be reopened immediately." From that moment, the Daniel Morris file, which had lain dormant for nearly 50 years, was officially returned to active investigation status. Everything started over: timeline, suspects, Whitman's travels, the Tennessee data gap, and the mysterious identity of Michael Granger. But this time, unlike 1964, investigators had something they never had before: evidence that could not fade, could not be lost to time, could not be distorted by witness memory. DNA. A trace that does not lie. And it had just dragged the case out of nearly half a century of darkness and back into the light. Immediately after formally reactivating the cold case, Caleb Rourke spent the first several days reviewing every original document collected in 1964. More than 300 pages of reports, interview transcripts, crime scene maps, case notes, scattered tips from the 1960s and 70s, and summary updates produced over nearly 5 decades. Rourke's first task was to assess the completeness of the file and flag anything missing or no longer useful. He noticed many transcripts had faded text, some map pages were torn at the edges, and several witness reports had fallen out of original order. Rourke reorganized everything chronologically, renumbered every item, scanned higher quality copies, and noted missing data such as lost crime scene photos or interview records about the green sedan that lacked original signatures. Once the file was fully organized, Rourke began the most important work, reconstructing the 1964 timeline using modern analytical methods, eliminating all details based on speculation or rumor, and retaining only verified facts. He documented each milestone precisely. The last moment Daniel was seen in the yard, the period when Lydia Carter turned away from the window, the moment the strange man first appeared according to the child witness, the moment the green sedan was seen leaving the neighborhood, and the moment Evelyn realized Daniel was gone. Then came the arrival of the patrol units and the most critical interval, the 30-minute gap between Daniel's disappearance and the arrival of authorities. This timeline, when rebuilt with modern tools, revealed something the 1964 investigation had never clearly shown: the suspect had a wide enough window to leave the residential area, access the open route to I-75, and exit the search radius before any roadblocks were set up. Rourke flagged this as a critical tactical vulnerability. Next, he re-examined every witness statement by categorizing them according to reliability, question type, and consistency. He divided witnesses into three groups: those who directly saw Daniel or the strange man, those who heard sounds or noticed unusual activity but did not see clearly, and those who provided later false tips. Rourke used a comparison table to identify details with high consistency. He found that the three direct witnesses all described the green sedan similarly. Long body, faded green, older model, and leaving the area between 9:46 and 9:49 a.m. Descriptions of the man, tall, thin, dark hair, were also stable across the first two statements. This allowed Rourke to discard most of the later rumors that described a different colored car or a man with a different build. When analyzing the old investigative errors in depth, Rourke highlighted three major strategic weaknesses in 1964: failure to block I-75 in time, failure to collect trace evidence beyond a 300-meter radius, and inconsistent follow-up on Whitman's movements in the days afterward. He wrote in his analysis, by modern standards, Whitman would have been placed under tight surveillance for the first 72 hours. That did not happen. Rourke also reviewed Whitman's record, combining scattered notes about his Tennessee activities to attach them to the post-1964 timeline. The result showed a series of movements with suspiciously matching dates, leaving Macon at the end of 1964, appearing in Tennessee in early 1965, the same period when records for Michael Granger first appeared at a vaccination clinic. Although nothing could be proven with the old data, Rourke marked this as a potential intersection point between suspect and victim. Finally, he compiled a new, clear, accurate timeline with no speculation and completely removed sections based on false tips that had distracted the original investigation. In his internal report he wrote, "The 1964 file, when reconstructed to modern standards, reveals consistent suspect behavior and a chain of events compatible with the victim being removed from the state within the first hour." All of this work allowed Rourke to pull the case out of decades of disorder and restore a coherent, logical timeline, the essential foundation before he moved to the next step, determining whether Michael Granger's DNA was a perfect match for Daniel Morris. To complete the reconstruction of Earl Whitman's journey after leaving Georgia, Caleb Rourke moved to the second phase of the investigation, tracing the exact timeline of Whitman's movements between 1964 and 1966 in order to pinpoint precisely when he left Macon and when he surfaced in Tennessee. This was the segment of data that had been overlooked due to the technological limitations of the 1960s, but with modern federal archival systems, Rourke was able to track down every fragment of civil, employment, and residency records scattered across three eastern Tennessee counties. He began by re-examining the Georgia records. The 1964 file showed Whitman vacated his residence around November, only a few weeks after his final police interview. A neighbor's report from the time noted a green sedan leaving the house early one morning around 6 a.m. and never returning. Rourke cross-checked tax records, residency files, and driver registration documents and confirmed that after November 1964, no paperwork whatsoever placed Whitman in Georgia again. He marked this as the definitive out-of-state departure point, perfectly aligning with the newly constructed case timeline. The next step was establishing Whitman's first appearance in Tennessee. In the old employment files of Roane County, the county where prior tips had placed him, Rourke located a 1965 entry from the Pine Mill Lumberyard recording an E. Whitman starting work in February 1965. The record was incomplete, but it bore the foreman's confirming signature and showed cash payroll. This gave Rourke solid proof that Whitman was in Tennessee no later than early 1965, only a few months after Daniel vanished. He continued scanning residency records, especially handwritten rental ledgers common in rural areas. At the Roane County Library, Rourke found an old rental address book in which Whitman appeared at a property on Maple Creek Road, listed as tenant Earl W., with 6 months paid in advance. Start date: January 1965. This was the first documented timestamp that matched long-held suspicions but had never been confirmed during the original investigation. With the Georgia exit date and Tennessee arrival date locked in, Rourke moved to the most critical piece, determining whether Whitman lived with or had any connection to the Granger family before Daniel appeared under the identity of Michael Granger. He searched census-style records in the 3 towns nearest Maple Hollow Road and located a 1966 church registry listing Margaret Granger and in the same household, a co-resident Earl W. The entry was boxed in a corner of the page, did not specify the relationship, and simply read person residing in household. This was a breakthrough because no prior evidence had ever linked Whitman to the Grangers. In the column Children in Household, a new line had been added in 1966. Michael. For the first time, an official residency record showed 3 people: Margaret Granger, Earl Whitman, and a child first recorded in 1966, the exact age Daniel would have been if he were still alive. Rourke kept digging for corroboration that this was not coincidence. A 1966 Roane County Health Department immunization record listed the person who brought Michael in as E. Witt. The abbreviated signature matched Whitman's handwriting from the Pine Mill payroll. The form also noted the accompanying adult was not the biological mother, but gave no explanation. In the 1966 property tax roll, the land was owned by Rob Granger and Margaret Granger, but the occupant section added a seasonal laborer, Whitman, living on the premises. The overlapping records housing, church, medical, temporary residency, and employment painted one consistent picture from 1965 through 1966. Whitman lived with or in immediate proximity to the Granger family, had regular contact with the child called Michael, and did so during the precise window when Daniel himself disappeared from Georgia. When Rourke laid every time stamp on the analysis board, the data formed an unbroken chain. Whitman leaves Georgia, November 1964, appears in Tennessee, January 1965. Living in the Granger household, by 1966, simultaneous with the first appearance of a child of unknown origin in church and medical records. In his internal report, he wrote, "The civil records from 1964-1966, when placed side by side, demonstrate Whitman had direct and sustained contact with the Granger family at the exact moment the child Michaels entered the picture. There is no discrepancy in his travel itinerary." This alignment did not merely reinforce Whitman as the sole logical suspect. It provided a factual foundation to seriously consider that Michael Granger was in fact a Daniel Morris abducted from Georgia in 1964 and reappearing in Tennessee with no birth certificate or provenance. Having established Whitman's movements and his clear connection to the Granger household in 1966, Caleb Rourke proceeded to the next critical step, interviewing the few remaining residents around Maple Hollow Road who might have seen Michael as a young child or knew anything about when he arrived in the Granger family. More than half a century had passed, so most people from that era were deceased or relocated. But GBI located several longtime residents, including 2 households that had been direct neighbors of Margaret and Robert Granger. The first witness was Edna Holloway, about 80 years old, who had lived on Maple Hollow Road since 1958. When Rourke asked what she remembered about the child named Michael, she answered without hesitation, "He showed up out of nowhere. One day there was no little kid, the next day there was, nobody ever saw Margaret pregnant." Edna remembered clearly because her family frequently traded food with the Grangers. She said Margaret never showed any signs of pregnancy, no belly, no doctor visits, nobody ever heard her talk about expecting. Then suddenly, there's a little boy about 2 or 3 running around. When Rourke asked if she thought he was adopted, Edna replied, "Adoption wasn't unheard of back then, but usually the church knew, the neighbors knew. This one, nobody knew where that child came from." The second witness was Thomas Keene, who lived 2 houses down from the Grangers in the 1960s. He said what stuck with him about Michael was a real quiet boy, didn't smile much, acted like he didn't know anybody except the Grangers. What caught Rourke's attention more was Keene's recollection of the period before Michael appeared. I remember for a few months the Grangers had an extra man staying there, didn't talk to nobody. Tall, skinny, black hair. Standoffish. When Rourke showed him an old photograph of Whitman, Keene studied it and nodded, "That's him. He lived at the Granger place." This was the second independent confirmation that Whitman resided with the family at the exact time Michael arrived, a crucial link the 1964 investigation had never proven. The next witness was Lorraine Chapman, now in her 70s, who had worked at the small grocery at the end of Maple Hollow Road. When Rourke asked when she first saw Michael, she replied, "I remember because I thought the boy didn't look like either Granger. Different eyes, lighter skin." More importantly, she gave Rourke a detail he immediately wrote down. "I saw Mr. Whitman carrying a strange little boy into the store once. The kid wasn't very big, maybe 2. Hair a lot lighter than Margaret or Robert's. A few months later, when I saw little Michael playing in the Granger yard, I thought it was the same child." Rourke pressed to make sure she wasn't confusing memories. Lorraine was adamant. Whitman only came in a handful of times, and only that once with a child. When the boy later showed up as the Grangers, I remembered it instantly because Whitman was never with anyone. When Rourke compared Lorraine's recalled timeline with the residency and employment dates he had already established, everything lined up perfectly: Whitman's first appearance in Tennessee, Michael's first official record, and Whitman's eventual departure from the area. Another witness, Cliff Murray, over 80, recalled seeing Whitman walking with a little boy through the pine woods behind the Granger house once. "I figured it was his grandson or a relative," Cliff said. "But when I waved at the kid, he looked confused, like he didn't know anybody around here." Though his memory wasn't sharp anymore, the description matched later accounts of Michael: shy, emotionally reserved, seemingly possessing no memories tied to any place except the Granger home. When Rourke compiled all the new statements, 3 consistent points emerged. 1. Michael appeared in the community, abruptly, no pregnancy, no legal paperwork, no explanatory story. 2. Whitman lived with or frequently visited the Granger home exactly when Michael was added to local records. 3. At least 2 independent witnesses remembered seeing Whitman carrying or walking with an unfamiliar toddler shortly before that same child was accepted as the Granger's son. Rourke wrote in his report, "The new statements are not only consistent with one another, they confirm a critical fact: Michael Granger was not born into the Granger family. The boy was brought there, and the person who brought him was, with high probability, Earl Whitman." For the first time in over 50 years, what had been only vague suspicion in the 1964 file was corroborated by multiple independent sources regarding timing, behavior, and the mysterious arrival of a child named Michael. Daniel, still accustomed to the name Michael Granger, took nearly a week to steady himself after learning his commercial DNA test matched multiple members of the Morris family in Georgia. After many sleepless nights, he finally called the GBI number Rebecca Morris had left in her message. The agent who answered was investigator Caleb Rourke, who explained briefly that the consumer DNA result was only preliminary and official confirmation required a full forensic test. Caleb stated calmly but firmly that they needed to meet Michael in person to collect a legally admissible biological sample, and that there is strong reason to believe you are directly related by blood to the Morris family. Michael agreed, though his voice shook as he spoke. He drove 3 hours to the GBI office in Atlanta, carrying a vague dread and the sensation that he was walking into a room that could rewrite his entire life. Upon entering the building, Michael was escorted to the collection room. The forensic technician explained the procedure: cheek and hand swabs, identification photographs, and signing consent for the cold case DNA database. The entire process took less than 20 minutes, yet to Michael it felt like an hour. The moment the swab touched the inside of his cheek, he felt as though every question he had carried for over 50 years was suspended in front of him, and the answers resided in those microscopic cells. The sample was rushed to the lab, where GBI employed three-generation genetic matching technology capable of comparing against living direct relatives. Rebecca Morris had already provided a reference sample, and crucially, the lab still possessed a viable DNA sample recovered years earlier from Evelyn Morris's hairbrush, preserved by the family in case Daniel's file was ever reopened. Evelyn had passed away long ago, but her DNA remained usable. The comparison between Daniel's sample and Evelyn's was the decisive step. Caleb and the forensic team waited in tense silence while the system processed. 3 hours later, the first results appeared as a matching graph. A technician glanced at the screen and immediately called Caleb. "The compatibility is extremely high. You need to see this." Caleb entered the room, looked at the chart displaying direct lineage genetic markers, and needed no further explanation. The curves overlapped almost perfectly. The final probability displayed 99.98%, an essentially absolute grandmother-grandchild match. There was no longer any reasonable doubt. Michael Granger was Daniel Morris, the 2-year-old who vanished from his yard in Macon in 1964. Caleb printed the report and walked straight to the waiting area, where Michael sat alone, fingers laced so tightly the knuckles had gone white. When Caleb entered, Michael stood instinctively. Caleb wasted no words, placed the report on the table, and said in a low, clear voice, "Mr. Daniel, we've completed the comparison. Your DNA matches Evelyn Morris at 99.98%. Michael stared at the sheet. His eyes moved over lines of scientific text he never imagined he would read. Grandmother-grandchild relationship, probability 0.9998. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His whole body seemed to freeze, and for several endless seconds he simply stood there, barely breathing. Caleb continued, "You are not Michael Granger. Your legal name is Daniel James Morris. You are the 1964 missing child victim, and the official record now confirms you are alive." Those words sliced Michael's, or rather Daniel's, life in two. Everything he had known suddenly felt as fragile as peeling paint on the Granger house walls, while everything he had never known shone brighter than the fluorescent lights in the room. Daniel raised a hand to his face. Tears fell before he could stop them. Linda, who had accompanied him but waited outside to give him space, rushed in when she heard his choked sob. When Daniel looked at his wife, he managed only one sentence, voice breaking, "I know who I am now." Linda wrapped her arms around him, and in that moment, the eyes of Daniel, the man who had lived his whole life in the shadow of a false identity, filled with an indescribable mixture of pain and relief. GBI completed the legal verification process immediately afterward, forwarding the official report to the federal system and notifying Bibb County that missing child case, Daniel Morris, had been resolved after more than 50 years. On paper, Daniel Morris was no longer a vanished toddler. He had been found, alive, carrying an entire misdirected life he had never known wasn't his. And that moment, a single DNA report on the table bearing the figure 99.98% became the bridge across time between the 2-year-old, who disappeared in 1964, and the man standing in the GBI office in 2015, about to confront the truth of who he really was. Daniel sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes before opening the door and stepping out, his legs shaking so badly that he had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. In front of him stood the small white house of the Morris family in Macon, looking both familiar and strangely distant, a place he hadn't set foot in for 51 years, though his memories of it were nothing more than a hazy, nameless blur. On the porch steps, Rebecca waited, her eyes red, but her gaze resolute. Beside her stood an older woman, silver hair, a small frame as though time had shrunk her. That was Daniel's birth mother. The woman who for half a century had written to the police every single year, holding on to hope long after everyone around her had grown weary. As Daniel drew closer, Evelyn braced her hands against the railing as if afraid her legs might give way. Then, when only one step remained between them, she lifted her face, her eyes settling on the face of a man now far older than the 2-year-old boy she had carried in her heart all her life. She lightly touched Daniel's cheek, her fingertips trembling. "Is it really you?" Daniel couldn't manage anything more than a choked breath. He took her hand and pressed it against his own cheek, as if trying to make up for every lost year. He had no memories to give back to her, no words sufficient to fill half a century of emptiness, but in that moment, his mere presence was the answer. Evelyn broke into sobs, 51 years of pent-up grief bursting forth. Daniel pulled her into his arms, an embrace neither of them had ever believed would happen. An embrace that had been brutally interrupted in 1964 by the hand of a man they would never have the chance to face. Inside the little house where the reunion unfolded, investigator Caleb Rourke sat back, not wanting to intrude on this tidal wave of emotion, but needing to be present to explain the final chapter of a case the family had waited more than half a century to close. When Daniel and Evelyn finally sat down, he needed a moment to compose himself before hearing the full investigation recounted. Rourke spread the documents across the table, the newly reconstructed timeline, DNA files, Tennessee records, and the mapped journey of Whitman. He began by recounting the entire case from the perspective of modern investigation, a long-buried story, undone by tactical errors, lack of evidence, and the silence of those who had since passed away. He explained that, on the morning of June 4, 1964, Daniel was last seen in the front yard. That a stranger, later identified as Earl Whitman, had appeared at the exact moment Daniel slipped from adult sight for just 2 or 3 minutes. That a green sedan left the neighborhood at the precise time Daniel vanished, and that police at the time missed the chance to seal off I-75, allowing the suspect to cross state lines within the first critical minutes. He described how the initial 6-month investigation hit a dead end. No new witnesses, no physical evidence, no arrests. Whitman left town, disappeared from radar, and the case was relegated to unsolved status. He spoke of the Granger family, where Daniel was taken, where no one had ever seen Margaret pregnant, where a child simply appeared sometime in 1966. And he revealed that Whitman had lived with them during that period, then vanished again around mid-1966. The same time Daniel showed up on vaccination records under the name Michael Granger. As Rourke laid out photographs and residency records, Evelyn studied each page, her hands shaking, but her eyes never leaving the details. She whispered, "I thought no one remembered him anymore. But it turns out, someone kept him, not to hurt him." Daniel didn't know how to respond to that. Inside him churned a tangle of feelings impossible to untangle. Gratitude for being raised, yet pain that his true life had been stolen. When Rourke reached the final conclusion, the room fell so silent that Daniel could hear the ticking of the wall clock. "We believe Earl Whitman was the person who took you out of Georgia," Rourke said, "based on DNA, the timeline, and the alignment of every event." Caleb opened the last folder, an old Tennessee death record search. "Whitman died in 1984, he said. Cerebral hemorrhage. No relatives, no next of kin, no one to claim the body." The words landed like an unfinished sentence in the room. No trial, no confession, no final explanation from the perpetrator. The only person who knew the whole truth, perhaps only him, had taken it all to the grave.
Yet, the most important thing was confirmed.
Daniel was alive, and he was the victim of an opportunistic kidnapping that stretched into half a century of living under another identity. But just as the family began to breathe a sigh of relief at having their child back, another question rose from Rebecca. What about Mrs. Granger? Did she know? Caleb paused several seconds before answering. "We can't determine her role," he said. "She may have been deceived by Whitman. She may have believed Daniel was a child who needed care, or she may have known more than the records show." Rourke offered no firm conclusion because the historical data was too sparse to either charge or exonerate Margaret Granger, who had died years before the file was reopened. That gap meant the case could never be fully closed. In the official report, GBI wrote, "Primary suspect, Earl Whitman. Associated individual of undetermined involvement, Margaret Granger. Degree of participation, inconclusive." Another question Caleb could not ignore. We still can't determine whether Whitman ever brought any other children to Tennessee. Records before 1970 were spotty, and Whitman moved around so much that the possibility of other victims could not be ruled out. Daniel stared down at the table, his hands twisting together. He whispered, "So, there could still be other children out there somewhere." Caleb nodded. "We have no evidence, but we also can't say there aren't." Finally, Rourke placed the investigation's closing report on the table. Daniel Morris file, missing person 1964, officially closed. However, the case involving Earl Whitman is noted as permanently reopened pending any new information. In the eyes of the law, that was the closest they would ever come to justice. But for the Morris family, Daniel's survival, even under a different name, was a gift no one had dared believe they would ever receive. That afternoon, Daniel stood in the front yard where he had once disappeared. A yard much changed, yet still bearing traces of the old paving stones. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand resting on her son's thin but steady arm. "Do you remember anything?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No," he said. "But I want to." Together, they looked out at the little road leading to the street, where a green sedan had once driven past, where a man had once made a 2-year-old boy disappear from his own life, and where, more than half a century later, that boy, now a man, had come back. There were no memories to reclaim, no explanation sufficient to heal all the lost years. But Daniel stood there, on the ground that had witnessed his life being torn away, and for the first time in 51 years, he belonged without having to question who he was. In the final GBI investigation report, under the notes section, Caleb wrote a short line. "Case closed, but questions remain open." In Daniel's heart, those questions lived on too. But beside them, for the first time in his life, there was an answer: he had been found. The story of Daniel Morris reveals a profound truth about America. Even though today's legal and investigative systems have advanced tremendously, small mistakes in the early stages, such as failing to seal off I-75 in time or relying too heavily on witness memory, can create consequences that last decades. The case also reminds us that DNA technology and modern genealogical databases, which did not exist in 1964, have now become powerful tools for unraveling mysteries once considered hopeless. Above all, Daniel's story reflects an important human lesson for American society today: never dismiss any unusual signs involving children. The fact that Daniel suddenly appeared in the Granger family, that no one ever saw Margaret pregnant, or the evasive responses when he asked about his birth certificate, all of these were signals that today's communities must pay especially close attention to. In reality, child protection agencies across the United States now advise that any child without paperwork, without a birth record, or with an unclear adoption story must be thoroughly examined, not to judge the foster family, but to protect the child's right to know their identity and origins. Daniel's story also underscores the importance of community in preserving collective memory. Seemingly small details, like neighbors seeing Whitman carrying a strange child, became the key that allowed GBI to piece together Daniel's entire journey after 51 years. This shows that a connected, observant, and vocal society can make an enormous difference in protecting children and aiding investigations. Finally, Evelyn's lesson, a mother who never gave up hope, reminds us that perseverance, even in the most hopeless circumstances, can still open the door to truth, especially when science and people keep moving forward together, never surrendering. Thank you for following Daniel Morris's 51-year journey to reclaim his identity. If this story touched you, please subscribe so we can continue exploring cases solved through persistence and the advances of modern investigation. See you in the next video, where every small clue can unlock a big truth.